I declare open this hearing of the Environment and Communications Legislation Committee into the 2022-23 supplementary budget estimates. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The committee has fixed Thursday the 20th of April 2023 as the date for the return of answers to questions taken on notice. The committee's proceedings today will examine outcome 2 of the Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water portfolio. Under Standing Order 26, the committee must take all evidence in public session. This includes answers to questions on notice. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. The Senate has endorsed the following test of relevance for questions at estimates hearing. Any question going to the operations or financial positions of the departments and agencies which are seeking funds in estimates are relevant questions for the purpose of estimates hearings. I remind officers that the Senate has resolved that there are no areas in connection with the expenditure of public funds where any person has a discretion to withhold details or explanations from the Parliament or its committees unless the Parliament has expressly provided otherwise. The Senate has resolved also that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Witnesses are reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. I incorporate the public immunity statement into the Hansard. I remind all senators that as we continue our work implementing the Set the Standard report, as Chair, I will ensure that proceedings are conducted in an orderly, respectful and courteous way. An officer called to answer a question for the first time should state their full name and the capacity in which they appear. Mobile phones should be switched to silent. I now welcome the Honourable Jenny McAllister, Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, representing the Minister for the Environment and Water. Minister, do you wish to make an opening statement?
No, I don't. Thank you, Chair.
I also welcome Mr Fredericks, the Secretary of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, and relevant officers. Mr Fredericks, would you like to make an opening statement?
No, thank you, Chair.
Excellent. We will roll straight into outcome 2, and we will canvass questions from each of the outcomes in outcome 2, as opposed to doing blocks by nature of the questions that we believe that senators have to ask. We will start with Senator Whish-Wilson.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you, Chair. My first set of questions is probably to you, Mr Knudsen, in relation to Senator Pocock's asked some questions and put some questions on notice previously in relation to a meeting with the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment with the National Farmers Federation CEO Tony Maha and Mr Richard Taylor on the 5th of April 2019 about a Jamlands compliance case. In response to Senator Pocock's third question on notice, be happy to give you the code for that. It's SQ22 000898. The department confirmed that the meeting was requested by the NFF, the National Farmers Federation. Can you confirm that that was the case?
That is correct.
Okay. How was that request conveyed?
Sorry, and I should have said Dean Knudsen, Deputy Secretary, Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. I don't recall, Senator, but there was discussions with the NFF over the listing and the specificity in that. And I think that was
I'm sorry, I'm aware of the details around that. Why wouldn't you be aware of how that was conveyed? Did they pick up the phone and call the department and say we would like to participate in this meeting?
Senator, no, I literally don't recall. So unfortunately, but I'm happy to talk about.
Well, can you take it on notice and find out how that meeting was conveyed?
Sure.
And by whom? Was it the CEO himself that contacted you? Was the meeting with Jamland in relation to the active prosecution, or was the meeting date already set, or did this meeting occur upon request of the NFF?
So the meeting was about the compliance matter.
Correct.
And effectively, what we were interested in explaining was the nature of what we had concluded with respect to...
Yep, I'm aware of those
Yep,
details
okay.
too. I'll just, if we can get through this fairly quickly.
Sure.
So I can take it that the meeting was already going to occur in terms of the compliance case with Jamlands, but with Mr Taylor. Or did the NFF request the meeting, or was it already going to occur?
So again, I don't recall the exact details of that, but what I do recall is, as I was mentioning, the concern of Mr. Taylor, the concern of the NFF, and also what points we were trying to make.
Okay. So were any ministers or MPs, members of Parliament, aware, and I use that word very carefully, aware of this meeting or involved in any discussions about it?
I do not believe so.
You do not?
I do not believe so.
You don't believe so? Okay. I know previously you've not been able to provide the meeting notes because it was before the courts. That court case is now finished as of yesterday afternoon, I understand. So I'll ask you on notice to table the meeting notes from that meeting.
Senator,
Yep.
it's Kate Lawler. I'm the Chief Counsel for the department. So there remains on foot proceedings before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal dealing with certain documents which have been requested by the Guardian under FOI.
That shouldn't preclude you from providing the information of those meeting notes to me or to any senator.
So there have been 4 sets of proceedings on foot, and we expect judgment this afternoon in relation to 3 of those. So we'd like to take away your question and come back to you with an answer on whether we can provide that brief.
So, Senator, we'll take it on notice.
Okay.
And it has been fast moving just because of the decision yesterday and a decision today. So we just want to reflect on our legal position, but we understand the import of your question and we will endeavour to address it on notice.
Okay. So we know through an FOI request from the Guardian, and it was written up in a number of news articles, that 2 briefs were written internally for this meeting that included advice from compliance officials that it was unusual, usually wouldn't be acceptable and may create a precedent around influences of third parties in an active investigation. In other words, could be a breach of Commonwealth prosecution's policy. Who prepared those? Who prepared those? That advice and why?
So, Senator, I think we've just agreed that we'll take away and come back to you on the question of how much information we can give
I'm
you.
not
in
asking you
relation
for
to
the
those
information
briefs.
exactly. That's a separate question. I'm just asking. I'm asking you who prepared the briefs and why were those briefs prepared?
Well, the briefs would have been prepared internally by the Environment Compliance branch of the department.
So it's a standard. That would have been a standard process, correct?
It would have been for a meeting with a proponent. Normally, we would have a brief prepared.
You would have had a briefing anyway, even if it had just been Jamlands on a compliance issue.
Yeah, absolutely. That
Okay.
would be standard practice.
Given the nature of that information uncovered by The Guardian through their FOI and published in the media, you know, pretty strong advice there. Why did the meeting go ahead with the National Farmers Federation in participation? And who made the final decision that they would be able to participate in this meeting?
So it is not unusual for representatives to be associated with a proponent. I can think of...
In the case of an active investigation, Mr Knudsen?
Yeah, so we've had cases, for example, you might recall some of the land clearing cases up in northern Queensland where we've had the individual landholder with also having different representation present. That has happened many times before.
So you're saying that this is not a precedent then?
No, I think what the...
Given the advice that this was unusual, that was your own advice, Mr Knudsen, would not usually be acceptable and may create a precedent, and I use that word very carefully and put an emphasis on the word precedent, around the influence of third parties in an active investigation. Why would that advice be provided to you in your department if this wasn't a precedent?
So the officers at the time, I can't obviously read their minds, but they felt that this was unusual because normally you would have an exchange directly with the proponent on an issue. In this case, the NFF was present. I'm happy to explain what the NFF's issues
I'm
were.
aware of what the NFF was doing there,
And
yeah.
that was-
yeah.
So as far as I was concerned, in terms of going ahead with the meeting, I remember that I wanted to make some points to the NFF in terms of we had clarified their issue, which was what was the nature of the grasslands that
Okay,
we were concerned about.
Yep.
And I also wanted to clarify some issues with the
So
proponent.
did you make the decision, Mr Knudsen, that contrary to this advice, that they would be able to attend in it?
I took that advice into account, but decided that it was appropriate to go ahead with the meeting.
Okay. Given the controversial nature of this, based on your own advice, your own department's advice, was the minister notified at the time?
No.
Right. Okay. Why not? Given it's a high
Because with
risk.
an active compliance situation, our policy effectively says it's the minister's role to set the framework for where the risk tolerances, et cetera, overall with compliance. So that they set the policy, but then it's to the department to implement, and that's what we were doing.
Right. So you didn't feel like it, even though it was a precedent and probably controversial, and that's probably why I'm asking you the questions. And it's certainly, I mean, we can talk about what it looks like in a minute, but that's probably not going to be helpful. But you don't believe it would have been worth bringing this to the attention of the minister?
No. And again, the minister's role is to set the policy framework, and then it's up to the department to implement, and that's what we were doing. And again, I have to say that my decision was that it was not controversial or inappropriate in the sense that I knew the NFF had some issues that needed to be clarified, as well as the proponent did.
Right. So was there any discussion, verbally or otherwise, or anything put in writing in relation to the fact that the NFF might join the legal case against the Commonwealth?
I do not recall that coming up at all.
Wouldn't that have been a risk that you should have considered?
So we would have considered, in effect, our legal standing. We were quite comfortable that we had a very clear case to be making. That's why we wanted to meet with the proponent and explain the basis of that case, explain the compliance policy, explain the implications. That is standard practice for a regulator, and that's what we did.
Okay. Could I ask, one brief prepared ahead of the meeting, also uncovered by the Guardian FOI, states Jamland and the NFF were seeking a further discounted approach to the compliance action. What does that mean exactly?
So, as I recall, Jamland held the view that, and this goes back to the clarity of the listing advice, that some of the grassland was actually of not of high quality and therefore not a viable ecological community. That's why they were arguing that, in effect, the initial sense of what had been impacted by the clearing was a larger quantum than what...
So could I ask what you... So I've just got to... If I could just finish this, Chair, I won't... Maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, and then I can... Okay. We can come back to it, or if...
No,
I'd
just-
ask for your
just
indulgence,
finish,
not
yeah.
yet, very politely. Thank you. So why was that your understanding of what they wanted? Had you had previous discussions with Jamland prior to this meeting?
So the compliance area certainly had, I hadn't. The compliance area had had discussions with Jamland over the extent of the impact. So that was one fact that needed to be established. And then the second fact was the quantum of listed grassland as opposed to the full cleared area. And that was a point of disagreement.
Well, could you check with your compliance department and take it on notice who asked exactly for this further discounted approach? Was it Jamlands or was it the NFF?
My assumption would be it would be Jamlands, but we'll absolutely take that on notice and come back to you.
Okay, and also, you know, who wrote the 2-page brief on that? That's been tabled
Senator,
under FOI.
The chances are it's not an SES officer, and normally we don't reveal non-SES officers who would be drafting those briefs, but I'll take that on
Okay,
notice.
well, we can follow that up. So following that meeting, I mean, I've asked you what's happened at the meeting. You're going to take that on notice, whether you can provide me with the details of that. Were there any verbal briefings that happened after the meeting, and between whom? Who did you talk to after the meeting?
Well, after that, we carried on with our compliance process. I do not recall any further discussions other than, well, actually, I'm going to take that on notice. I know there were no discussions with the minister or the office. That much I can assure you, because again, I was very conscious of the line that I wanted to maintain in terms of the minister's role versus the departments.
Okay. And that was the line that you're talking about there is in relation to the policy versus...
That's correct. Versus the implementation of the policy, that's correct.
One of the briefs also under FOI obtained by The Guardian states that up to the April 2019 meeting, the last prior correspondence with the department, or the last prior correspondence the department had with Jamland was the 22nd of August 2017. Why was there such a long gap in communication? You're saying they were already talking to your compliance department?
Well, that's where the conversation would have started when we had, and again, I don't remember the details, we're now going back 6 years ago, but when the initial compliance matter would have been commenced, and we'll come back on notice, but effectively we would have been establishing how much land had been cleared, et cetera. As I mentioned, there was disagreement on the quality of the land impacted, and so that would have been undoubtedly part of the initial discussions back in 2017, which then led to the process where we finally came back in 2019 to have that discussion directly. But again, we'll confirm all of this on notice because I don't want to be misleading the Senate.
Last question for me, Chair, and perhaps if you could come back to me later. So records on the department's FOI disclosure log show the department held another meeting with the NFF in March 2019 at which possible regional approaches in the Monaro region were discussed. What was this regional approach that was under discussion, and can you table or take on notice to provide me any briefs about it? I understand that's been withheld under FOI, and I'd like to know why that was withheld.
Yeah.
Can you tell me why that was withheld under FOI?
Sorry?
Could you tell me why that was withheld under FOI?
I do not know off the top of my head, but happy to take it on notice.
But you would know, though, if you were at the meeting and you've been overseeing this, what this regional approach that was under discussion was about?
Unfortunately, I don't recall, but happy to take it on notice and try to provide as much clarity as possible about what the intention of that was.
I find it hard to believe you don't recall that. So that point, Mr. Knudsen, given.
So, Senator, one of the things.
I appreciate you're a busy man. But,
that's it. It's not about my level of busyness. The compliance area was quite busy and trying to figure out, undoubtedly working with the proponent about what are the possible options. So, and I just don't have that information at hand, sorry.
Okay. Look, perhaps if I could just ask you one last question, sure. Then you may not need to come back to me, Chair, on this issue. Was it a mistake, in hindsight, to have let the NFF attend this meeting, given they co-joined the legal case?
No,
because,
the Senator, it was really important. I felt that the integrity of our listing system and explaining why we had landed where we had landed with respect to that ecological community was really important to explain to the NFF. Also, as I mentioned earlier on, we felt very confident in the strength of our case and therefore felt, and it's completely appropriate that a regulator sit and explain the basis for their position, what the options were that were available to the landholder, and that's what we did.
I understand that, but in a case that's under active investigation, in relation to a compliance matter?
Again, Senator, as I said earlier on, it is not unusual for a proponent to have other representation in a discussion.
Well, just once again, we circle back to why this was a precedent based on your own department's advice, and not a good one or a risky one based on what they were saying. Could you provide examples of where this has happened in a compliance case?
Senator, I already did, and I'm happy to provide more where proponents have had
provide
other
them on
advice.
notice, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Dunnigan.
Thank you, Chair. If I could go to the DQ quarterly report, performance reports, that we need to have at the table would be helpful. I just wanted to understand when the next edition of the updates will be provided on this quarterly performance report? The last one I can find here online appears to be from the 4th of October last year.
Quarterly report, Senator, with respect to what?
Referral decisions made with number of on-time decisions from 1 January 2016 through to 30 September 2022.
Thank you, Senator. James Larson, Deputy Secretary, but I have here my colleague Bruce Edwards, the First Assistant Secretary of the Environmental Approvals Division.
Hi, Senator. Bruce Edwards, Head of Division Environment Approvals.
Hello.
So we're fairly close to publication of the latest update, so we can talk a little bit in this session, obviously, around our performance,
Sure.
but it's not out there yet to answer the question.
Fine. And I don't want to ruin the surprise, whatever might be in it. When do you expect to have that tabled or published?
I think within within this month.
Within this month?
this month.
Okay. And that will be up until what time, what date?
So that'll be to Q4 2022.
So that will take you to December, is that
Yep.
right? Okay, end of December. And what's the normal time frame beyond the end of the quarter to publication? Like what length of time do you normally have between results and publication?
Senator, I don't know that there's a standard time frame, but what we would seek to do is make sure there's not a full lapse quarter since the last update. This last 6-month period for 2022, we've tried to get the full picture of the last 6 months of the year. So
Sure.
It's just taken us a little bit longer than we would have hoped.
Okay, so you try and do it within the following quarter. I understand that. That's fine. That's your benchmark. That was what I was going to get at. All right, and you can't really tell me much about the results that we're going to get on that. I will wait for the next edition of this. Look, I do probably have some questions then around this, and you may have to take them on notice. We'll see. But since June the 1st of last year, how many referral decisions or approval decisions have had the statutory deadline extended?
We would need to take that on
Okay.
notice, Senator.
All right. This could be a very quick night. We'll see. Or afternoon. Since that same date, the 1st of June 2022, how many EPBC Act referrals or approvals were non-compliant or contained errors? You're going to tell me on notice, aren't you? Okay. all right,
Unfortunately,
let's do
yes. So Senator, there's a range of
sure.
decisions, and some are well set up at the beginning when we receive the material, and some take some time. So we'd have to come back to you with those stats.
Sure, okay. But that's not something you publish in these updates, is it?
No. And so just to explain, for example, the first point of a referral is a validation process. So we even have points before we formally receipt that referral to make sure that they've reached all the requirements of referral. So there's several gates, and that can impact future points of that assessment process as well.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Perhaps in the same basket then, how many decision briefs in the environment component of Minister Plibersek's portfolio have been provided to the Minister's office since the 1st of June 2022? How many of these briefs were signed in the timeframe recommended by the department? I presume there is a recommended timeframe for sign-off by Minister. And how many have not been actioned or classed as needing no further action? So again, I expect you'll have to take that on. If you
Happy to
could,
take
I
that
would
on
be
notice.
eternally grateful. Nothing to add then? Great. All right, I'll keep going with questions to perhaps put on notice. Can I ask how many EPBC Act assessments has the Minister made on coal projects as Environment Minister to date? And how many coal projects have been approved or rejected?
Yes, so the Minister has made one decision relating to
That's that Queensland one?
coal, yes, and that's Central Queensland, which was a rejection, Senator.
Okay, that's fine. How many assessments of the same variety are currently awaiting decision on coal projects?
I might be able to help you
Sure.
there, Senator. So currently, well, it depends on how you look at the numbers, of course.
Yes.
But in terms of active coal and gas projects to the end of 2023 under consideration by the Environmental Approvals Division, There are currently 9 approvals under consideration and 6 referrals are under consideration.
Sorry, could you repeat those numbers? Sorry, Mr. Larson.
With respect to coal and gas projects under consideration by the Environment Approvals Division to the end of 2023, we currently have 9 approvals under consideration and 6 referrals under consideration.
Okay, excellent. All right, that deals with gas, and there have been no decisions made on gas yet, just the one on coal. Is that correct?
Senator, by the Minister?
By the Minister, yes.
So that's correct.
Okay. By the department?
So we have, there has been gas-related decisions by a departmental delegate.
Okay. Are you able to tell me how many?
One.
One?
Senator.
And was that a rejection or a...
That was an approval.
Okay. Where was that one for?
That was in Queensland, and it was the Towery development by Santos.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Just back to the performance on on-time decisions. Where are we at in, like, what percentage are we at in terms of on-time decisions, if I can go back to that at the moment?
Senator, so I've got the snapshot for the latest month, so we track this very closely to try to stay on track with statutory deadlines. So February was a very good month. We reached 100% on time for statutory decisions.
And how many in that 100%?
I actually don't have that information, but we're talking somewhere between 30 and 50
Okay, if you can take on notice the number, and
Yep.
yes, that's great.
Yeah, it does vary, of course, month to month, but that's our objective, to hit our statutory timeframes.
Sure, indeed, yes. Okay, so that's February, January or December or any other months?
Don't probably have the full month by month going backwards, so I just got the latest information.
How about on notice?
Happy to do that.
Let me know what they are. That would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Did you want to do your chair? Is it all right if
Senator Davey.
Sure. I have some questions about the EPBC Act as well. First one, Minister, are you aware of a proposal by the Carbon Transport and Storage Co, or CTS Co, to have the Queensland Government amend Section 41 of their EPA Act to enable CO2 sequestration into groundwater aquifers?
It sounds like a matter for the Queensland Government. I don't know if officials have anything to add. It's not something that is before me.
Senator, I don't think we...
The specific, and yes, the changes to their Act obviously are up to the Queensland Government, but the reason for their lobbying for a change to the Queensland Act relates to a project they have to do a carbon capture and storage project, which I believe was referred for a decision to the EPBC. Proposal number 2021/9122, Surat Basin Carbon Capture and Storage Proposal. Are you aware of that proposal?
Senator, yes, I'll ask Mr Say to speak to that proposal, but I understand it was considered by us, and I believe it was not a controlled action, but Mr Say will have some detail.
Yeah, Mark Say, Acting Assistant Secretary, Queensland Assessments and Sea Dumping. That project, I believe, was referred last year and determined a not controlled action. I don't have a whole lot more detail on that, but that decision was based on an assessment of impact on matters of national environmental significance, and in that case, impacts to water resources. It wasn't a coal mine or a coal seam gas project, so hence we couldn't consider those impacts to
Could argue
water
it's
users.
the reverse of one of those projects. It's like, what do you mean when you say it's a not controlled action?
Senator James Larson, Deputy Secretary. So if it's not a controlled action, basically it's not an action. So the action is referred by a proponent, and it's not an action. If it's a controlled action, it's an action which we assess falls under the terms of the EPBC Act. If it's not a controlled action, that reflects our assessment that that the matter doesn't give rise to issues under the legislation.
Right, and my understanding is if it was a coal seam gas extraction project or if it was a mining project, it might fall under the water trigger for consideration, but this didn't fall.
Senator, each proposal is put forward by a proponent is considered on a case-by-case basis, and it depends on the information that's presented, and of course our assessment of that information. And as I said before, in some circumstances, obviously, the conclusion is that it's not a matter which enlivens the provisions of the EPBC Act. In other circumstances, of course, it does.
My understanding is that the proposal was lodged on the 9th of January and then approved or determined as non-controlled on the 9th of February, which is a very quick turnaround. So congratulations, the wheels of bureaucracy can move quickly. But did you actually, when looking at the proposal, did you give consideration to what impacts it would potentially have? Like, did you actually look at the proposal, or did you just go, this doesn't meet any of our triggers, so congratulations?
So Senator, obviously the material provided by the proponent is considered, and the assessment in this instance was that it was not a controlled action, and that was the decision.
Sorry to interrupt. I wonder, just in going around in this little circle here, Senator Davey, are you aware of the criteria
For the
matters of national environmental significance?
Yeah, I am aware of those,
Okay.
and I think that's why the reason why I'm questioning on this particular project is there is a lot of concern that on this proposal the aquifer in mind that the company is proposing to pump CO2 into as part of my understanding is it's a trial. But the aquifer is within the boundaries of the Great Artesian Basin, and there is a lot of community angst that not enough scientific consideration was given to in the case of leakage or contamination beyond the aquifer in question.
Senator, we're happy to bring back some information or take on notice what was considered, but just to detail, that test for a controlled action for us is likely significant impacts on a protected matter. So it doesn't mean there's no impacts. It's just a different threshold that we would consider. So we're happy to come back on notice about the particular instances. And just to assure you, there's quite a bit of information required and considered at that first stage. So it's well beyond a tick and flick. It's quite a thorough assessment about the proposed action.
My understanding is CTSCO's submission actually identified that the CO2 being injected, and I think this comes from their submission, CO2 injected into the precipice water source will in effect render that useless to anyone else in the future. And this is where the concern is, if that water source is then useless, and whether there are any other groundwater licences within the vicinity that would be rendered useless, or how confined that particular precipice aquifer is.
So Senator, as my colleague Mr. Edwards has said, we will come back to you with the basis on which that decision was made, that it's not a controlled action. But as Mr. Edwards said, it is a matter of national environmental significance. So there's a question of significant impact, and those issues will, of course, have been taken into account. But we will, of course, get you further information.
Yeah, because, I mean, the Great Artesian Basin and the department itself identifies the Great Artesian Basin as a very significant basin, generates approximately 13 billion a year and is a vital resource for 180,000 people. So there is, people just want reassurance that you have done a thorough investigation into this project to ensure and assess impacts. And if you can then reassure people that if any project such as this were to go ahead, notwithstanding the fact that the Queensland Government would need to change their legislation as well.
Yes, Senator, we'll get you information on the particular matters taken into account in that decision.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Rice.
Thank you, Chair. Recovery plan here in 2.4.
Senator, we have the relevant people available, so I'll invite colleagues from the Biodiversity and Conservation Division to come to the table.
While they do, Senator Rice, I'm not sure if you were here at the very beginning of the hearing, but we've indicated that we'll just range broadly across outcome 2. We are not seeking to subdivide it into those other areas.
Excellent. I was elected to the Senate in July 2014. No, I took my seat in the Senate in July 2014. And in October 2014 estimates, I asked my first questions about a recovery plan for Leadbeater's possum. My estimate is that I think this is at least my 26th estimate that I've asked questions about the recovery plan for Leadbeater's possum. At last estimates in October, I was told that we're looking to finalise the recovery plan as soon as possible. We share your deep concern for the situation, asked the department to give it urgent focus, really been asked to give this priority. So, when are we going to see a recovery plan?
Cassandra Kennedy, Division Head for Biodiversity Conservation Division. Thanks, Senator. So we have been working with very closely with Victorian officials since last estimates, including on how we can, and I think we also mentioned last estimates about trying to make sure that we could co-fund the priority research that the TSSC had identified needed to be done. So we've been doing quite a lot of work to see how we can co-invest in research that has already been started by the Arthur Rylah Institute around work that needs to be done for the Leadbeater's possum. But in relation to the recovery plan itself, we're working in the department as we speak to have the updates that need to be done that are necessary since the consultation was done in 2019. There have been some changes in regulations, for example, that need to be reflected. And we plan to have that back with the TSSC for consideration so that it can be finalised as soon as possible.
So, back to the TSSC for consideration, so when is that going to be?
Well, the TSSC next meets, I'm not sure, in a couple of months' time, but we're working on it. It's happening.
So can you outline for me, you say you've been working with the Victorian Government, what are the concrete steps that have happened since last estimate?
The key concrete steps are what I was talking about in terms of the research that needs to be done. And I mean, that has been something that's been identified as critical by, I think, all parties for some time. So I'm really pleased that we're able to partner on that work, and there had been some underway already. And what we're looking to do is co-invest to be able to expand that research to make it as meaningful as possible right now. So there's Dr. Kiesling would be able to potentially add to the sorts of work that is underway through that institute now, but also look to what sort of work we can invest into next financial year and keep that going into the medium term. So I think that is very critical to what we need to have alongside the recovery plan as that is finalised and comes online. But I will also say, as I know you've heard me say before, Senator, that in the meantime, I'm also aware that the conservation advice is in place, and also the other main development that I think is relevant is that there's also been some, issues that Victoria is working through down there in relation to forestry operations in the RFA area.
Okay, the TSSC, so you hope to report to the TSSC and have the TSSC sign off on the changes required by their next meeting? Is that what you're committing?
That's our current plan, is to have those updates done and to have it go to the TSSC for their consideration at the next meeting.
Will we then be in a position to see a recovery plan at next estimates, at budget estimates in May?
Look, I can't. We can take it on notice about the exact time frame, so it still has to go through a couple of steps to get for further consideration, and it will depend slightly on what the TSSC says at that time. So I can't tell you what the TSSC's decision will be, but what I can say is that those updates that we know need to be made from the department's perspective are being done now, and our aim is to have that with the TSSC at the next meeting.
Okay. Could you take on notice exactly when the next TSSC meeting is? You don't seem to have the date here.
I don't have it in my head. I don't know if Dr. Keesley
Yes, we can
does.
take it on notice,
Yes.
Senator.
Thank you. Recovery plan for the Southern Greater Glider. What's the update on that?
So the recovery plan, which will cover both species of greater glider, is currently under development. Dr. Keesling would be able to provide more detail on that.
Ilse Keesling, I'm the branch head for the Protected Species and Communities branch. Senator, yes, as Ms Kennedy has indicated, the recovery plan for both species of greater glider is in preparation and will be finalised for Threatened Species Scientific Committee consideration. We cannot give an exact date for that because there are a number of public consultations, or a number of stakeholder consultations, I should say, that are underway to complete the draft of the recovery plan.
So given those stakeholder consultations, how long is that going to take?
Senator, I can't give you an exact time frame on. This. This is a species of priority, and we are working to finish the recovery plan as quickly as we possibly can.
Am I going to have to ask about greater gliders, the 26 sessions of estimates as well?
Senator, I very much hope not. As I say, this is a priority
You
species.
can't even guarantee that it's not going to be 26.
Well, Senator, if I might say, it depends. Ultimately, there are consultations which will take place, and it depends.
It depends. So, and meanwhile, you haven't got we know the difference between recovery plans and conservation advice in terms of their binding nature. So you can't give me any timeline other than you've got consultation, and maybe it's going to be another 5 years.
So, Senator,
by what you're telling me.
Senator, I think you've heard from the Officer of Commitment that we have work in train. That work involves consultation and engagement. And we can't give you a precise time frame as to how that will play out, but you have that assurance.
What's the timeline on the consultation?
We can take that on notice and provide more detail.
And who are you consulting with?
We can certainly provide that as well.
You're aware that on Friday in the legal case where Vic Forests in a great deal of pain, as we know, because of their illegal logging. In the court yesterday, Vic Forests basically was saying that the prospective coops that wanted to log had more greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders in them than they expected. They're really very prevalent in most of the areas that we operate in, which means that coops are not viable to log because of the amount of the buffers and additional reservations that are required under Her Honour's orders. Do you expect that the recovery plan actually will show that it is not viable to protect greater gliders and to continue with industrial scale clearfield logging of their habitat?
Senator, I think that's a matter which will be the subject of close review and the subject of those consultations.
So you okay, and so basically, yeah. I mean, could you understand that the public might think that you're not really serious about the protection of these endangered species? That you're happy for these processes to go on for year after year after year, and meanwhile the logging...
Senator Rice! We're trying to conduct these hearings in a respectful fashion.
Meanwhile, endangered species are hurtling towards extinction. And 26 estimate sessions later.
I appreciate your frustration, Senator Rice, I really do, but I don't think that's an excuse to shout at the public servants that are sitting here trying to answer your questions. If they cannot answer them, they will take them on notice But they are trying their best to answer your question.
I'm sorry if it was perceived as shouting.
Can I
It
just
was
say also,
intense
Senator,
frustration.
not only are these officials trying their best to answer your questions, they're also trying to get to their best to fulfil their duties. They've given you detailed evidence about the requirements of consultation. You're a supporter of consultation, I know, Senator, and that's a good thing. And we want to do it well and we want to do it properly. These officials conscientiously go about that business.
I would just like to have some commitments to some timelines, because meanwhile these animals are hurtling towards extinction, and we have a commitment to zero extinctions, which is a complete opposite with these processes.
So, Senator,
and these consultation processes, if there was a commitment to no logging in the meantime, fine. But
So,
meanwhile,
Senator,
the logging continues.
Senator, the officials have taken on notice your questions about timelines. What I can give you a commitment to is that the officials will follow proper processes and do the sort of consultation that you, Senator, would expect.
Senator Rice, I joined the Senate shortly after you, and I understand your interest in these particular species and in conservation more generally, and I acknowledge that continuing focus and interest as a feature of your public life. So I understand your interest and indeed frustration at the slow progress. I think you will have seen a change in approach from our government. Minister Plibersek has moved very quickly to process the findings of the Samuels Review, which describe a range of ways that the legislative architecture was not functioning to protect animals from extinction. She's provided a roadmap that the government intends to implement in terms of reforming those laws, which improve the institutional arrangements as well as the laws themselves. And she has also established a series of processes to increase the resources that will be applied to nature conservation, so if it's maybe nature positive. It is a big agenda. It doesn't take away from the obligations for the department and the government to work through the existing processes, including the ones that you're asking about now. You should understand that the government is determined and serious about our efforts in nature conservation. We don't accept that the efforts under the previous government were adequate, and it's on that basis that the Minister has laid out the reform agenda that she has.
Thank you, Senator. Can I then take you to, and yes, there are processes in train, but as I said, meanwhile, the logging continues, which is the big issue. And, for the 9 years I've been in the Senate, meanwhile, the logging has continued while these processes have been in train. Can I ask whether the department, and indeed yourself, is aware of the journal article published recently by ANU academics about how well do immediate protection areas conserve biodiversity in Victoria's forests?
Yes, Senator, I'm aware of the article.
So, have you had a briefing prepared for the Minister on the article?
No, Senator, I haven't had a briefing prepared for the Minister, but I have talked to our colleagues over at the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, who have responsibility, as you know, for compliance under the RFA agreements to make sure that they're also aware of the article. And there are the annual meetings under the RFA. Those meetings are taking place with Victoria very shortly, so we'll be sure to follow it up.
Does the department disagree with any of the research in the report?
We're still looking at the science. It's a peer-reviewed journal, so I'm sure that there are good points made there, but I'm sure there is other context that needs to be considered as well, but I haven't had a chance to look through it in detail.
So you're aware of it, you haven't read it or evaluated it then?
I've read it, I haven't evaluated it.
And will you be preparing a report for the Minister on it?
We will work with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry in relation to particularly the crossover with compliance under the regional forestry agreements to make sure that that is taken into account. But in a broader sense, absolutely, we'll be looking at it as well.
I mean, the compliance is pretty clear that it's not, that the RFAs, that the logging that's occurring is not compliant with protecting threatened species. I mean, it says the immediate protection areas put in place in 2019 do not protect substantial amounts of important habitat for threatened species like the Leadbeater's possum and the southern greater glider, and that the IPAs failed to include the most suitable habitat areas with high quality habitat remaining in forests scheduled for logging, current IPAs are unlikely to adequately protect biodiversity from logging. So,
Senator, you have our assurance that we will raise these, we have already, and we will continue to raise these matters with the relevant department, which is the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries.
and what's the timeline that you're going to be doing that on? And when, is the department considering telling Victoria and the options, which I've discussed at previous estimates and with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, that the RFAs are not compliant and should be withdrawn, should be scrapped?
So, Senator, it's a compliance matter, and it's a matter, of course, for the Department of Agriculture and Forestry and Fisheries. I apologise for sort of saying that in a sense, Senator, because I appreciate it's frustrating, but that is the division of responsibilities within the Commonwealth. At the same time, as you know, the government has committed to very substantial reform of national environmental laws. The reform program includes taking forward the recommendation by Professor Samuel concerning addressing regional forestry agreements by reference to national environmental standards. So there is a reform program underway, but also at the same time we are using tools at our disposal to progress the matter.
Can I, given the report and given Ms Kennedy, you say that you are aware of it, to get your commitment that there will be a evaluation and a report given to the Minister on it?
Yes, I would be happy to. I think we can definitely do that. Yes.
Perhaps I just might say, Senator Rice, that the Minister is deeply engaged in the reform process and is regularly briefed on the progress of that reform. I appreciate the officials' reticence in sort of providing a specific indication here that certain matters will or won't be referred to the Minister, but as a general principle, the Minister is deeply engaged in the reform process, and indeed you will see her speaking publicly about it on a very regular basis, and she is regularly briefed about these matters.
The frustration, as you know, is that yes, the Minister is very aware, but meanwhile the logging continues. And meanwhile there is, important critical habitat for species which are threatened under federal environment laws, which is being destroyed.
Senator Rice, I think I've indicated to you already the basis on which the Minister seeks to reform our national environment laws. You don't have an argument here that the current arrangements are insufficient.
Thank you. I've got more, but I'm happy to... I've probably had my 15 minutes at the moment.
Indeed you have. Senator Wish... Oh, do you have... Senator Duniam.
Thank you. All right, so if we can go back to projects, and in this case I want to refer to some questions on notice I placed, reference SQ 22 000 677, which related in part to the 18 projects that were being reconsidered.
Yes, Senator, I'll just invite my colleagues from Environmental Approvals Division to join us.
Thank you.
Could you give us the number again?
Yes, it's SQ 22 000 677.
Thank you very much.
And it was rather a lengthy one. Well crafted, I might say. So just in reference to those, I'll start generally. The 18 projects I do ask about in those questions, where are things up to with the reconsideration process? And is it something that applies to all 18 as a job lot, or are they at different stages, each of them?
Senator, so they are, there has been a process around that in terms of attracting public consultation around those reconsideration requests, and those processes are, we'll need to dig out the exact dates, but towards the end of last year were completed.
Were completed, did you say?
Sorry?
What was completed?
In
Sorry,
terms of compiling the information, additional information from people. The process now is a very detailed one, and so what will occur and what we're supporting the Minister to do is pull together all the information received, and we're talking about tens of thousands of additional pages, and the Minister will support the Minister to consider those in due course. But the important rule in these things is not to preempt that decision, so to make sure that the Minister has that information. She'll turn her mind to each of that.
I'm not going to ask you to preempt.
Yeah, I might have cut you off at the chase.
No, I wouldn't do that to you. Yeah. Senator McAllister won't let me do that. But if I can... you mentioned the tens of thousands of pages of information. What is the nature of that information? Where does it come from? How do you procure it? What are you seeking? Is it voluntarily provided by proponents and members of the public? If you can just step me through that, that'd be helpful.
I might ask Ms Gowland to talk a little bit more to the detail. Yes, Senator.
So Kate Gowland, Acting Branch Head for the New South Wales ACT Assessments Branch. Senator. So could you just repeat the question, sorry?
The last question I asked.
Yep.
Well, the first question was in relation to the processes, and we didn't quite get to an understanding of where we might reach a conclusion. I know that you can't say it'll be done by March the 30th, but I guess a rough idea of where in the process we're at, if it were a timeline. But the second question I asked was around this additional information, and a reference was made to tens of thousands of pages. I just wanted to understand the nature of it, how the department comes to be in possession of it. Is it something you go out and seek, or is it voluntarily provided by proponents or members of the public? If you can just explain that to me.
So in relation to the reconsideration requests, Senator, the information is provided by the applicant for the reconsideration request, and that's what's under consideration.
And does the department ask the applicant for it?
The applicant provides the information, Senator.
Okay, and they just decide what they'll provide?
Well, yes, they submit with their application what they consider to be new information.
Okay, all right. So there's no guidance provided, it's just we think this would be important for you?
I'm not aware that there's any guidance around how to submit a reconsideration request.
Sorry if I sound silly, but
I might be able to
that's a lot of pages that this might be useful to a reconsideration. Yes.
So Senator, the reconsideration requests were made publicly available for comment from the 3rd to the 24th of November last year, and that allowed some 15 business days for public comment to be submitted, and it's that material which was now being considered.
Okay. All right, and so some of the answers I received in response to the questions on notice sort of basically said the relevant projects are under assessment, review, until a decision, so answers 17 through 20, until a decision whether or not to approve a project has been made under the EPBC Act, the precise number of jobs in the case of question 17 cannot be determined. So I just want to go to those questions. Has any further, are you able to provide any more clarity on that, or is the same answer going to be the one you will provide because the process is ongoing?
We would stand by the answers provided to the question on notice, Senator.
And so will that information be something that is factored into the decision-making process, that the questions I've asked on notice previously?
So obviously the reconsideration requests have been made. The public commentary period has allowed for additional commentary, and so material that's been submitted will be considered, Senator.
Okay, and based on the answers provided previously, answers to those questions will be something I can procure perhaps in May or at a later date.
Senator, subject to the process, but yes.
Yes, of course, yeah. Once that's concluded,
it does depend.
You indicate to me that I will be able to get answers to that. So then, I wanted to just ask about the, there was an article in The Australian on the 21st of November by Dennis Shanahan, which I'm happy to table, Chair. It just talks about the cost of these projects. And it was based on some modelling which I think may have been the subject of a question in question time done by the IPA suggesting that if these projects didn't go ahead, that it may cost 174,000 jobs. Are you aware of that article or the modelling? Is that something?
I don't recall that article, Senator.
I'll provide that to you.
But
And on that basis, you might want to take anything I ask on notice.
Very good, Senator.
In the interests of time, given it's Thursday night. So, I mean, look, perhaps on notice then, you know, if you can look at the article and the material that informs the article, which is included there when you have it, can you let me know whether that is indeed in the concerns raised in the article? Are they the sort of thing that are taken into account in a process?
We will of course provide information on that, but I guess the core point to make, Senator, is obviously the legislation sets out a regime which has to do with matters of national environmental significance. Those are the matters which we as an agency are required to address in considering proposals.
Okay. All right. I may have a further question on notice in relation to that specific element of those 18 projects and the economic benefits just flowing on from that, and I expect I might get a similar answer, but at least it gives me a guide. How many staff within the division, is that the nomenclature we apply? Oh, good. Look at that, I got it. Have been tasked to this reconsideration process?
On the reconsideration issue, I'll ask my colleagues if they have those details.
Well, there's been a number of different staff over the period working on the project, so probably
Perhaps
about,
on notice
I'd say about 5 or 6 staff, yeah.
Yeah, so
okay.
Senate people obviously will be doing different work at different times, so we will bring them in, and we also draw on legal support for that.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Take that on notice, please.
Yes, that'd be great if we could just perhaps how many and what sort of hours have been put into the work that's required here. Let me see. I think that'll do me on that particular issue. Do you want to? I've got others on different areas if you want to.
Yes, I've got a series of questions on waste and recycling. Thank you. I put some questions on notice late last year around the collapse of REDcycle, but I don't believe we've actually had a face-to-face session since that's happened. I understand the department was notified of the collapse of REDcycle, you know, for several weeks before it was made public. What did the department do when it was notified about the collapse of this scheme? It's obviously become a significant matter of public interest.
Thanks very much, Senator. Kate Lynch, Division Head, Environment Protection Division. So, yes, the department became aware that there were concerns around REDcycle soft plastic stockpiles when we met with REDcycle along with other industry representatives on the 27th of October.
Yep.
So that was just prior to the suspension of the REDcycle scheme on the 9th of November. When we were made aware of the emerging concerns, we obviously had been in discussions in that meeting with other industry representatives, and so engaged in a series then of follow-on conversations about the nature of the matter, and to try and gather and ascertain as much evidence as possible about the breadth of the stockpiling and the concerns around processing capacity. We also undertook to provide advice and provided advice to the Minister at the time and to her office about the emerging concern.
And what advice? What would that advice been about? If it's too much, perhaps if you could table that, or
yeah, we might take that on notice. Given that you're asking a question about advice to the Minister, so we understand the importance. We'll take it on notice.
So to kind of fast forward to last week. A number of media articles around long wait to unwrap soft plastics recycling disaster. I think everybody admits it's a disaster. Supermarket giants announced return of soft plastics recycling by late 2023, despite lack of recyclers. Perhaps I might start with this question to you, Minister, if you don't mind. Minister Plibersek was quoted in the article by Tracy Ferrier on March the 7th, 2023, as saying she was prepared to regulate if the industry doesn't fix this issue. Could you be a bit more specific about what fixing this issue means?
So I didn't see that article, Senator Whish-Wilson, but perhaps I can say this. I think there are two related and important things happening here. The first is that the REDcycle collapse is, as you indicated, extremely disappointing, and the Minister has spoken frequently about her disappointment in that outcome and the consequences it has for ordinary people who do their best to make a contribution by recycling their own plastics. As you, I think, understand, a task force has been formed. It requires organisations that would ordinarily be competing to work with one another on this problem, and so that required ACCC agreement for that collaboration to take place. And those entities, the supermarkets, have established a pathway to resolve this problem. Okay. For completeness, I'll just say that that's a really important feature of the policy response, because those organisations should play a leading role in solving these kinds of problems, and that's the basis on which we think about these policy settings. More broadly, there is a reform process going on around the arrangements for stewardship around plastics.
Well, and I've got some questions coming up on that.
Yeah, and so I think, I don't know, I haven't seen the article or the context for the Minister's comments, but I am aware that she is thinking about the regulatory arrangements in that broad context. Okay. Officials may be able to provide further advice, additional advice.
We'll definitely get, I've got some quite detailed questions on that Australian Packaging Covenant as a voluntary products, accredited voluntary product stewardship scheme under the Act. I'll get to that in a minute. I understand that the information that was in a number of articles, the Canberra Times, Sydney Morning Herald, was that the supermarkets have hoped a pilot scheme at a number of select stores will be operating by late 2023, and they've called that a joint roadmap to restart. But that is contingent on the ability to clear REDcycle's existing stockpiles of soft plastic, which sounds contingent on shipping waste overseas to free up limited domestic recycling capacity, which I understand your government is investing in. Doesn't sound like anything's going to happen quickly. I'm just interested in at what point the Minister does step in and regulate. Are you happy with that, with a pilot scheme starting later this year on the collapse of...
So, Senator, I think it would be important for Ms Lynch just to provide some detail on what is happening now, what it'll solve, and where we're trying to get to.
Yes, so Senator, the work that Soft Plastics Task Force has been undertaking since it was granted ACCC interim authorisation back in November has been to look really at the state of the current processing capacity to treat this particular stream of plastics. There's, of course, many different types of plastics, and in this case, we're talking about mixed soft plastics, which is a unique processing capacity. And there is...
Which we've known about for some time, in all fairness,
yes.
Like in terms of that lack of capacity to recycle these kind of plastics. But this scheme's been going for many years.
That's right, Senator. So in the early days of the scheme, the REDcycle program had commercial arrangements in place with a number of recyclers in Australia who could take that material, and they converted it into a series of different products. That being said, some of the issues that sort of led to the collapse of the REDcycle scheme it was a bit of a culmination of factors, including that some of those processing facilities were no longer able to take the REDcycled soft plastics. In part, there was a fire at one facility, and in part there was a lack of demand coming through during the pandemic, and combined with extremely high levels of additional volume.
Would it be fair to say that there's just a lack of market for that recycled product, and the recycling industry has been asking for government, and this is not necessarily your area, but I've certainly been putting it to the infrastructure department and others, that they've been crying out since 2020 for government procurement to lead that market for road base and a whole range of things. Would that be a fair fair
Yeah, so
assumption?
Senator, look, I think it is absolutely a fair point that there is a difficult lack of market demand at the moment for that particular plastic type, but that's very closely tied to the nature of the processing capacity. So the market, if you can process it with the right equipment, then it opens up more opportunities to use the residual material. But putting it into roads and things like that requires a lower level of processing capacity.
But the recyclers are telling us it's a chicken and egg thing. Why would they invest in recycling upgrades? And they've also been saying this for at least 5 years, unless they've got the certainty in the policy framework that there'll be a market for especially procuring this kind of product for not just for government procurement but also more broadly for commercial, but that's not there at the moment.
Yeah.
And we'll get to, sorry, I'll let you.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah. Thanks, Senator. Look, I think it is important also just to also flag that, as you've indicated, you're aware there is a stream of additional recycling processing capacity that has been funded, has been announced, and those processing plants are coming online across Australia. And we do expect very significant volumes of new plastics processing capacity to be available here on shore over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. The problem now is that we're just in that transitional period. So what the Soft Plastics Task Force has been doing is looking at the likely timeframes for that additional capacity to come online, and they've been looking at how they can feed through the existing red cycle stockpile materials, process those, deal with those so that they don't need to go to landfill. And then as soon as they have, we know that there will be empty capacity, if you like, at that point to recommence the collection of soft plastics.
This is an industry-led scheme. What gives you any confidence they're going to solve this problem, given they literally haven't given a shit about it for decades? And I'm not Janet, we've all got our frustrations with asking these questions for 11 years, but there's been no movement by the industry. The Food and Grocery Council have always lobbied against regulation. We've had big stoushes in the Senate when the Product Stewardship Act came through recently. I mean, what gives you any confidence that they're going to, especially given the kind of language they're using just this week around pilot schemes and barriers and obstacles to progress, what gives you any confidence they're going to fix this?
I think, Senator Whish-Wilson, this goes to the issue I alluded to in my earlier answer, that there are two parallel things happening here. There is an immediate challenge associated with the red cycle collapse, and there is a longer-term reform process that's been agreed by states and territories to drive harder against the long-term problem. So I
was going to start with that, but I thought I'd start with red cycle first. I wasn't sure which one.
So the officials can talk you through it at a time at a time of your choosing, but the state and territory ministers have met and agreed on a timetable for reform and a whole series of actions to bring forward a revised national policy framework.
For generally for packaging across the board. All right. Well, I might, while I can, I might jump from red cycle to this exact issue, Minister. So I got some questions back on notice in relation to this point, and I asked, what discussions have occurred between the Minister and the Department and APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant, on not meeting their 2025 targets, and what outcome, if any, was decided on. The response I got was the Minister, Mr Plibersek, is waiting the outcomes of the review and is expected to first meet with APCO in early 2023 to discuss the findings, including industry progress and next steps. Could I just check, I've got through an OP, order of production of documents, I've got a draft final, I think was a final draft copy from late dating to December last year. Has that review been finished? When's it going to be published? And has Minister Plibersek met with APCO yet?
Senator Cameron Hutchison, Branch Head of Waste Policy and Planning Branch. The review by APCO has been completed and delivered to Commonwealth, State and Territory Environment Ministers and was delivered on the 22nd.
22nd of February?
Yes, last month. Yep. The review was absolutely scheduled to be delivered in 2022 and was delayed by a number of factors on APCO's end, including, we understand, some pretty acute COVID workforce issues. That report has now been delivered to Environment Ministers, though.
Including state?
Yes, state, territory and Minister Plibersek.
State, okay. Could I ask, so in response to some questions and some other questions I asked you, and I can give you the question numbers if you'd like them, but I'll keep it fairly broad. You said that as of 21st of October 2022, in response to question 3, Environment Ministers, at the Environment Ministers meeting, ministers agreed to reform the regulation of packaging by 2025 to ensure that all packaging available in Australia is designed to be recovered, reused, recycled and reprocessed safely in line with circular economy principles. What does by 2025 mean? And that's when the targets are due to be met.
That's correct, Senator. So the reform commitment agreed last year essentially puts in train now the concerted effort that we have to work through in terms of regulatory impact analysis, looking at different options for the reform of packaging regulation across the country. The date of 2025 in particular that you're referring to is the date that we anticipate having whatever is agreed at a national level given effect in each of the states and territories. So there are a couple of pathways for reform that would see work needing to happen at both the Commonwealth level in terms of legislation or regulation, and then potentially implemented through state or territory legislation. So that is, I suppose, the estimated timeframe to allow for those processes.
But isn't that when the target's supposed to be met? So we're basically, we know from reading this report, which I thought was very, very telling, and APCO have named up a lot of the issues they're facing, their internal structure and free riders and a whole range of things we've talked about before. They've been clear they're not going to meet their targets on some of the key aspects, so that's fine. They're obviously ambitious targets, but they're not going to meet them. They don't necessarily, they're not calling for a mandatory approach, or some of the feedback at their roadshow was certainly calling for mandatory approaches. Are we now going to wait until 2025 before we regulate it? Why aren't we regulating them now?
No, so Senator, the steps involved to get to that final date in 2025, as I described, would include, for example, a decision being taken forward for Environment Ministers' consideration, a preferred reform model being taken forward to the consideration of Environment Ministers in 2023, so this year. That is essentially that sort of first major step. The 2025 timeframe, as I said before, it relates to when whatever is agreed would be given effect across the country. The other thing that is important to note, of course, is that the 2025 targets are voluntary industry targets.
That's right.
They are ambitious. They are not likely to be met on the basis of the evidence before us in this report. But it nonetheless, doesn't hold that having the targets in place is still a useful exercise.
Does that surprise you though, Ms Lynch, given 20 years of failure by APCO to ever meet or come even vaguely close to their targets?
So, Senator, I believe that we have plenty of evidence to hand that the complexity of some of the supply chain ecosystem here is also has also played a part in failure to meet those targets. The point I was going to raise before is just also that while undertaking the reform in terms of the regulation, it's going to be really important that we continue working across governments and with industry to improve compliance of the current arrangement. So governments are currently also identifying opportunities to improve communication with industry across the supply chain on their existing obligations, and actually developing a communication engagement strategy too that will deliver specific online communications material in conjunction with some of the peak bodies. So I think it's important not to give the impression that we are sort of now taking the foot off the pedal and not doing anything. The current regulation is in place until new regulatory reform is agreed, but the first major step we would expect to see is a consideration of the preferred reform model by ministers this year.
Okay. So just to be clear, you do have some packaging, plastic packaging on the minister's priority list, is that correct?
I believe on the priority list, Senator, we have plastics in healthcare waste that are currently listed. Plastics in healthcare products. That was newly listed to the current financial year product list. There are also problematic unnecessary single-use plastics
Correct.
that are on the Minister's priority list.
Okay, so obviously banning certain kinds of plastics to keep them out of the waste stream or contaminating waste streams, or regulating them the same but also different. With the other, given we know APCO is going to fail to meet its voluntary targets, and given no government seems to have wanted to regulate them in the last 5 years to make sure they met those targets, will you be putting APCO on the, or more broadly as an accredited product stewardship scheme, on the priority list? Isn't it designed to kind of give them a warning that, you know, you're on your last chance?
Yes, Senator. So the priority list certainly can be used for that purpose. I don't think we would see that we would have to put APCO's product stewardship scheme onto the Minister's priority list. It's sort of has a slightly different intent there, but there certainly is. Off the back of the review of those national packaging targets, the Minister has already made very clear her intention to consider regulation, and she also has agreed with her counterparts.
What does consider regulation mean, though? Surely we've been considering this for...
So at the Environment Ministers meeting last year, ministers did agree to that we need we need a reformed regulatory framework for packaging. So that is a decision that's been taken, and that is now being it's basically being assessed, and we're looking to identify the best, most sort of effective regulatory framework.
So, Senator, I think just to understand the government's position, Australia has not come close to meeting the targets that were set by the previous government. There are a lot of big announcements, and as you have regularly highlighted, we are not even close to meeting them, and the report last year confirmed that this was the case. So the Minister has... this is something that we must do with states and territories, and as you acknowledged in your earlier comments, it also involves some quite complex questions around the manufacturing and industrial ecosystem up and down the supply chain of plastics. The recycling end of it can only ever be part of the solution. It's the design features upstream that will make all the difference. And so it's on that basis that the Minister has gone to her counterparts in states and territories, agreed with them a work program to bring forward policy options, and that work program will be being developed by officials over the course of 2023. There are a series of quite concrete steps that officials have been requested to undertake. Ms Lynch may be able to talk you through some of them, but it is a program of policy work to overcome the deficiencies of the last government, who made a lot of big announcements and absolutely no progress towards them.
Okay.
Senator Whish-Wilson.
Maybe I'll just, if you could just give me one last question and come back to me when you get a moment. Thanks, Chair.
That'd be great.
I also asked a question around, what's in last year we had a lot of discussion around the International Negotiating Committee on a binding UN treaty on plastic pollution, and Australia's seemed to be playing a leading role in that, and I asked for some details on that. And the response I got was Australia strongly supported the development of an ambitious, legally binding instrument on plastic pollution and is playing an active role in the negotiations. How difficult is it for us, maybe this is a question to you, Minister, for us to play an active role in a legally binding international scheme on phasing out plastics and sorting out plastic packaging problems when we don't have a legally binding scheme in our own country? I mean, don't you see a juxtaposition there or an irony in that?
Well, I think I've indicated that the government does not think that the progress to date has been adequate. I think we would always approach international negotiations in a spirit of humility. We don't think we have all the answers, but there's two things going on. There's our intention to be a good international citizen and to play our part in driving international action. Some of these supply chains do cross national boundaries, but also our intention to work hard in our national environment to get our house in order, and that's the work that I'm referring to in my earlier answers.
So just to be clear then, based on what you've told me today, I'm sorry, will that APCO report be released
Yes,
I mean, I've
Senator.
obviously seen it. And
Sorry, Senator, it is our understanding that it's APCO's intention to release it shortly.
Okay.
Yep.
So that'll be released, and there'll be a joint meeting of State and Commonwealth to talk about implementing. Does it make recommendations? Does APCO make recommendations in this report?
APCO doesn't make recommendations in the report, Senator. It certainly makes findings and also identifies areas where industry, governments can work together to try and make further progress, but it doesn't make recommendations.
And States and Commonwealth have worked with APCO through this process to get it to its final iteration, so you've had input into it already?
We were certainly consulted in the development of APCO's review, well, throughout APCO's review process. APCO also did considerable industry consultation to develop the report. It is APCO's report, so I wouldn't accept a characterisation that we contributed to the report or contributed to the drafting of it, but we were certainly consulted through the process.
Okay, because there's a lot of stuff in this OPD around that has department emails attached to it in terms of providing advice on different things that need to be looked at in the report.
We certainly worked with APCO around the development of the terms of reference, and we worked with our state and territory colleagues in the same vein to make sure that all governments represented at the table were going to be comfortable with what APCO was going away to deliver, but it was very much APCO's responsibility to.
But you're confident that it's going to be a solid independent analysis that federal and state ministers, including you, Minister, can make decisions on how you progress. You trust this report to give you what you need?
Senator, I think what Ms Lynch has already laid out is ministers have already agreed that they want to take a look at the range of regulatory options to push forward. They'll require advice on which approach is most effective, and that will drive the reform.
Whose advice will they get?
It'll be the Commonwealth advice.
Your department? Okay.
Absolutely. We have to develop, this is what Ms Lynch was talking about, was we have to do a regulatory impact statement effectively for the different options to figure out which regulatory option is going to be most effective. We certainly have the report on the existing regulatory framework and its inadequacies. That will be taken into account in terms of providing that advice. But we have a statutory obligation, in effect, to make sure that ministers are making that decision on the basis of really robust regulatory analysis, and that's what we'll be developing over the next 2 years.
Please don't take this personally, Mr Knudsen, but I'm not sure, there hasn't been a lot of activity out of the department on looking at this in the last 5 or 6 years, in terms of where will you get that expertise to provide that advice. I know maybe it's a decision obviously it's a decision of government whether you regulate these industries, but I'm not filled with confidence that.
Senator Wilson, we're coming up on half an hour. We're going to
we wouldn't ask the officials to make comment on the policy direction of the previous government, but I can tell you that our policy direction is very different. We had an election last year. The minister's been very clear about her expectations. My personal experience is that this department comprises a very large number of very talented people, when pointed in the right direction, are capable of doing very good things.
Yeah. So could I just a point of clarification? I will
just one.
And I'm not going to make it. It's not a question. I will say actually there have been some good product stewardship schemes that the department's put out. So I do want to put that on record. Okay. But on packaging,
Thank you. So if I might, Chair, I just would like to clarify for the purpose of Hansard, just that there are two different reviews that we're talking about here, Senator.
Yeah.
So you were asking then about whether the APCO report, which is an assessment by industry about whether industry is meeting its voluntary targets, would that provide the robust evidence we need for regulation? That is a different process to the independent review that the department commissioned of the co-regulatory arrangement for packaging across the country. And we have looked at that review. We're now taking that review's recommendations to governments and commissioning cost-benefit analysis of different models.
Okay, will you be able to provide that review to us
Absolutely.
on notice? Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
I might just follow up.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure. What's been the trajectory of Australia's plastics consumption and disposal over the last decade?
So thank you very much, Senator. It's probably fair to look at the National Waste Report, which is probably the most consistent release of figures here. It's released biennially, and the most recent release of that occurred at the end of last year. I'm just going to make sure I have that data to hand. So the 2022 National Waste Report set out that Australia generated an estimated 75.8 million tonnes of waste, which is equivalent to just under 3 tonnes per capita. It's 2.95 tonnes per capita. The 4 largest sources of waste were building and demolition materials, organics and hazardous waste, and ash. Recovery rates were the highest for metals at 87% recovery, building materials at 81%, paper and cardboard, which was 62%, organics at 58%, and glass at 59%. Overall, what we did see was that there's been some positive progress on some targets. So we're looking at this as a time series right from 2016-17 right through to the present.
So targets were set into, you're saying that there were targets set?
Yes, so Senator, the National Waste Report data is kept in a continuous biennial cycle since 2016-17. It's done every 2 years, and the National Waste Report, the National Waste Policy Action Plan uses that as essentially baseline data to see what has happened in terms of progress. So in terms of positive progress, what we've seen is that there's currently 80%, in relation to target 3 under that plan, which is to work towards 80% average resource recovery rate from all waste streams by 2030. The report shows that we have increased by 2.2% since 2016, up from 60.8% to 63.1%. There's also been an increase in the use of recycled content by governments and industry. The report shows that over that period there's been a 15% increase from 36.1 megatonnes to 41.6 megatonnes. But it also showed that there's been limited to no progress against some of the other targets. So particularly in relation to Target 2 of the National Waste Policy Action Plan, which is to reduce total waste generated in Australia by 10% per person. The report shows a 3% increase in waste generated per person.
Quite the opposite direction.
That's right, yeah, from 2.86 tonnes to 2.95 tonnes over that period. We've also seen organic waste sent to landfill for disposal increase over that period by 3%, from 5.74 megatonnes to 5.89 megatonnes. So I think overall it's fair to characterise it is still very much a work in progress, trying to really drive change towards these national targets.
It's a little alarming that we're not kind of getting there. What's stopping us? Is it a policy setting scenario? Is it knowledge? Is it infrastructure?
Look, so Senator, I believe that there's quite a bit of evidence that's been released about the complexity of the waste and resource recovery sector. There has been very different, so the lack of harmonisation across the country has certainly proven problematic. So we see high levels of contamination in recycling streams. So we see a lot of different systems that operate across the country. There's 50 plus different ways that household waste is collected and recycled at the curbside across the country. And that makes it hard for consumers to understand what they should be doing with waste. Over the last few years, we can see some attribution, we think, from the pandemic, which reduced the amount of commercial and industrial waste, but in return we saw a lot more household waste over that period. But generally speaking, we are seeing a lot of confusion in the system in terms of consumer engagement. I think there are some key sectors in the economy too where we have seen really good progress to try to improve recycling rates, but there are some very big sectors that could do a lot more to really step up and better manage and reduce the amount of waste that ultimately goes to landfill. It is a complex problem, and I don't think there is a silver bullet, but it is. There is a stream of activities, a lot of activities that are at the moment underway, trying to push us towards achieving those targets. The Minister for the Environment has been very clear about the focus that she places on increasing harmonisation between governments and how important that is, and also on looking at the evidence and being prepared to actually regulate where voluntary arrangements aren't proving successful.
Great, thank you very much. Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. That was quick. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time this evening. I'm also keen to ask some questions about recovery plans. Clearly, this is something, as a mega diverse country that's a world leader in extinctions, I think needs to be more of a focus. So I guess to start, I'm just interested to hear why these plans are taking so long and why there's so many plans that haven't been completed.
Hi, Senator Cassandra Kennedy, Division Head for Biodiversity Conservation Division. I think that, as you're aware, through the Nature Positive plan that the Minister has released, there is a commitment from the government to really look at the way that the current system is operating in relation to recovery plans and conservation advices, and the way that they work in the situation that we're currently in, which obviously is a biodiversity crisis, as I know you've pointed out. And so we are looking at ways to do that better, and we're in the middle of consultation with stakeholders on that. Specifically in relation to recovery plans, we are still, that doesn't mean that the fact that we're looking to reform it doesn't mean that we've stopped working as hard as we possibly can to get those recovery plans in place in the meantime. And I think there's been 2 more finalised since the last time we were here at estimates, and we've got a number of others that are with states for their final consideration prior to being finalised. So I guess in summary, we're really working hard to get through the backlog, but it is a system that was designed a long time ago without an understanding of the situation that we would be facing at the moment, and that's why the Minister's put in place the Nature Positive plan, and we're looking for ways to do this better into the future.
In the future. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. How many extra staff has the new government given for the team that's doing recovery plans in the department?
I would need to take on notice the exact number of staff, but what I can most usefully say is that there were, at the time of the Black Summer bushfires, there were additional staff that were provided to work on this, but they were very time limited. But luckily, what we've been able to do is maintain both the staff and some additional resourcing, which lets us be able to bring in some external expertise as well, and keep that momentum going. To be able to keep that kind of up-paced work on the recovery plans. The Threatened Species Scientific Committee, and I know that you have the chair coming to speak with the committee soon as well. I mean, the pace that they're getting through this work as well is really quite incredible. The dedication of that committee and their commitment to getting through the listings and conservation planning work has really been. I don't know what the right word is, but that very committed group of individuals there that have worked very hard to keep up with the pace.
And I'm just interested to understand, roughly how big would the team be that does recovery plans? Are we talking 10 people, 50 people, 100 people?
Well, I mean, the team. My division is quite large, so and just exactly working on recovery plans themselves is not a very easy thing to target. So the division itself works on recovery plans and conservation advices and the recovery of species in a number of different ways, and we try and do it as intermeshed way as we possibly can, right through from the listings and conservation advice and recovery planning through to the work that we do with the program programs that fund some of that recovery work and other things. So if it's okay, if I can take it on notice, we'll try to explain how it is that we resource this as well as we possibly can.
Senator, maybe I could help just in relation to James Larson, Deputy Secretary. As Ms Kennedy has explained, the work is done across a whole range of people within the division. But if it's useful, that the Biodiversity Conservation Division, which is the responsible division for this line of work, the current the headcount as at 31 December 2022 was 204, and that represents an increase, obviously reflecting the government's priority on this work of 19 or so, from 185 back in September 22. Obviously numbers move around all the time and it depends, but you have a real focus by the government and the department on this work, and a real determination to address the recovery plan issue, and that's where we're at.
So Senator, we'll take that on notice just to give you some
the
best numbers we can on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I will just, Senator, can I say two things? One is the officials, as the officials have indicated, the advice from Professor Samuels was that there needed to be a shift away from planning at individual species level towards a more sort of strategic approach at landscape scale, and I think you're aware of the reforms that are heading towards that. In the meantime, we are conscious of the obligations to keep focus on these species and on the planning process. It is a pretty big contrast to the approach taken by the previous government. They scrapped 176 plans, just decided that they weren't required. We are working within the existing law at the same time as we're trying to reform it to make it more effective and to get better outcomes.
Okay, thank you. And so the new government is committed to implementing all of Professor Samuel's recommendations?
We've obviously provided our framework to respond to Professor Samuel's recommendations. That's the Nature Positive Plan, and it's a very big piece of legislative and organisational reform, and we're working through that over the course of the coming year.
Mm-hmm. Senator, if I can say that the response the government has put out is quite exhaustive about the response to Professor Samuel's various points. And just to reiterate, there's a really important interplay between some reform on conservation planning, but also the government's made it very clear that one of the key objectives here is to protect more of the habitat and the landscapes that matter most. The response, for example, talks about identifying areas of high ecological value and effectively saying that development will, in the vast majority of cases, not occur in those areas. That is not the current approach to the legislation. The legislation is completely process-based. This is trying to switch pretty dramatically to laying out very specific outcomes that are being sought for the country that strike a balance of sustainable development, but are very clearly saying there are certain areas that are more important ecologically and from a heritage standpoint than others, and those deserve a higher level of protection than currently exists.
No, I really appreciate that, and the commitment to transition there. I guess there's a number of species that are like on the brink, and so in that transition time, we need to be using the existing laws to try and protect things like the swift parrot, which I'm really interested in the updates to the 2011 swift parrot plan and where they're up to.
Yes, so Dr. Kiesling will be able to give more detail, but as I understand it, we're very close to finalising the recovery plan for swift parrot. It's one of the ones that is just the Minister has written out to the state counterparts to seek their joint making of the instrument, which is obviously the preferable approach to these. So we would expect that to be finalised very soon.
Can you give me the date that it was given to the Minister?
I could give you, I think we might have the date that the letters were written to the to state colleagues. Do we have that here, Ilse?
Senator, I'm Ilse Kiesling. I'm a branch head with the Protected Species and Communities branch. We don't have a date that the draft recovery plan was provided to the Minister. We can take that on notice. But just to confirm Ms Kennedy's point that the Minister has written to the states, and the states that have relevance here are Tasmania, Victoria and New South Wales, seeking their commitment to joint making of the recovery plan for swift parrot.
Thank you. Does the minister have to respond in a certain amount of time, or is it just an open-ended process?
We had asked Minister Plibersek had asked for responses by the end of February, so we're just in the process of following those up now. I understand we haven't received all responses yet, so we're just making sure of that, and then we'll be providing further advice to the minister so that she can make her decision very shortly.
Can the minister advise if any of the states have requested subsequent changes to the draft?
I don't have that information before me. Officials may be able to assist.
I would have to take that on notice, but Senator, my understanding is no. At this stage, it's a settled document, and what we are inviting the states, what the minister is inviting the states to do at this stage, is either sign on with the Commonwealth to that recovery plan or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Can I move to the? How much time have I got to?
You have got you can have another 10 minutes.
Oh, heaps, thanks. To the nature repair market. I'm interested...
Get the right officials to the table, Senator.
Sorry?
It'll just take a second to get the right officials to the table.
Thank you. I'm interested in finding out how much the government is planning on spending to set up and administer the nature repair market, including purchases, Commonwealth purchases of biodiversity certificates, as has been described in the draft bill. Is there a budget for that?
Senator Lynn O'Connell, Deputy Secretary. My colleague might introduce himself as we'll cover
Anthony
both
Benny,
these areas.
Acting Division Head for Biodiversity Markets, Economics and Environmental Science Division.
Senator, I think in terms of those questions, they're deliberations for government in the budget context.
Minister, can you provide any?
So, Senator, our practice isn't to disclose matters that are being considered as part of the budget process. And so I'm not really in a position to provide information about whether what is under consideration. But we are, of course, in a position to speak more generally about the legislative reform process which is underway.
And the timeline for introducing and trying to pass the bill, what would that look like at this stage?
O'Connell may be able to help.
Yeah, Senator, we had the bill out for consultations. Those consultations closed on Friday. So there are a number of things that have come back in terms of those consultations. Our plan is to have the bill introduced in the first half of this calendar year.
I guess my question is, will we see those numbers before we have to vote on the bill, or...?
That really is a matter for government, and I'm not in a position to provide advice on that.
Minister, you are the government, like you're in the government.
Yes, but the government works within a cabinet environment, and the decisions of the cabinet are protected until such point as the cabinet makes a decision to announce them collectively. So I'm not in a position now to make that available.
Okay, I don't want anything confidential, to be clear. I just want to know if will crossbenchers and everyone else know how much you plan to spend on this before we have to vote on a bill to set it up? If it's all, sucked into this cabinet confidentiality.
Senator Pocock, perhaps I can take that on notice and see what information we can make available to you.
That'd be great, thank you. Just in terms of the way that you see the market operating, could you talk me through some of your assumptions around the demand for biodiversity certificates and where that will come from?
Yeah, certainly, Senator. Happy to talk you through that. I would point to a piece of work that was released a few months ago and done by one of the consulting houses, PricewaterhouseCoopers. They did an estimate of the demand for the biodiversity nature repair market, and their estimate was that the market could unlock
137 billion in financial flows to advance Australia's biodiversity outcomes by 2050. So that's an estimate done by
and that
a
is
consulting firm.
That is on a purely voluntary market?
Yes.
Or is that offsets?
That's as I understand and read their report, is how they have structured the model underneath it.
Has the department done any of their own thinking or modelling on this, or was it all based off the PwC report?
Oh, Senator, the PwC report is relatively recent, so that was December 2022, and certainly in terms of creating the market, it's our expectation that, you know, in terms of what is needed for nature repair, it can't just be done by government alone, and there is certainly an opportunity for the private sector to invest, and that's what the market is about, drawing private capital in. We have seen lots of interest from companies about the market, and indeed just last week I was down at the Institute of Company Directors event talking about the opportunities of the market, linked with the work that the Global Task Force on nature-related financial disclosures is doing as well, and of course social expectations and demand for nature.
Okay. Are you able to provide, what did the department pay PwC for that report?
No, PwC did it without being paid by the department. We didn't commission it.
Okay, so just off their own. Was it commissioned?
It wasn't commissioned by us.
It wasn't commissioned by us. It came out of a discussion I had with someone in PwC in terms of the work that we're broadly doing, and they decided to do it. They're not alone in terms of the consulting houses that have released material in relation to nature, valuing nature. The move for TNFD, I mean, it's a global movement on things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and that drives interest in people getting involved in measuring the environment, doing advising on potential disclosures, etc. So it's a broader push.
And in terms of getting this market going, do you expect the government to have to put in a big sort of capital injection to get it going, or do you think there'll be private money from the start with an untested market?
Well, I think the first thing in the market is to provide a supply opportunity. So the first thing is for people to be able to supply certificates into the market. So that is landholders who will undertake nature repair activities to be able to supply. And I mean,
And who will pay for that to happen in the first instance?
Well, do you want to outline how that?
So I think in terms of interest from the private sector, there's certainly some of our engagement with the sector that there is strong interest to invest in nature, but without the rules and a high integrity system, a public registry system and a transparent process, there's unwillingness to invest at this stage until those kind of arrangements are in place. So the draft bill, and as we further develop it, is intending to provide that strong integrity of environmental and biodiversity outcomes in a transparent way, informed by science, and in utilising a public registry system that should the private sector purchase those certificates, then there's an evidence base that they're achieving those outcomes as intended.
Okay, so just trying to understand that better, you're expecting from the get-go that the private sector will step up and purchase, or the government will need to get it going, have proof of concept, have some certificates sort of being shown that they have integrity for the private sector to then be interested, or I'm just a bit unclear.
Yeah, so there's certainly learnings from our work on the agricultural stewardship pilots that have demonstrated how to put this into practice with landholders and build the supply aspect, so to support landholders to be able to deliver these outcomes, and then working with the private sector to better understand these opportunities. But there is certainly interest from the private sector to understand this. The work that TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, is doing a lot of engagement with the private sector around these issues and how to better understand nature and nature dependencies. but there is definitely a growing expertise in some of those companies as they get their head around these issues.
I think one other real practical metric is through the carbon market, so, purchasing ACCUs, that ACCUs that have got a biodiversity co-benefit with them attract a premium price in the carbon market right now. So that demonstrates that people are willing to invest more for that biodiversity co-benefit. It's a real kind of practical example of how the carbon market is operating with that additional biodiversity co-benefit.
Thank you. I mean, that's really helpful.
We'll just need to rotate the last question.
Last one. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to understand. With the ERF, it took the government spending $2.55 billion to get that going, to then create this market. So I'm trying to understand, like, how much are you recommending the government invest in this to make it a market?
Well, Senator, I think we kind of covered that earlier, and in the legislation, it does...
covered it.
Oh, sorry, in terms of the budget consideration that Senator McAllister was talking about.
Yes, we had talked before about the constraints on making announcements about decisions of the Cabinet. I'm not in a position to provide advice.
I don't want to know an announcement, but I'm just wondering if... So you have suggested to government how much they will need to spend to make it work?
Again, had such advice been provided, it would be in the context of a Cabinet process, and so it's not able to be disclosed.
So I can't even ask if advice has been given. That seems really broad. Is that...
Yeah.
It's never an easy position for us as public servants here, but the answer to your question is, unfortunately, in this case, is no, because it would be advice provided in the context of seeking a decision of Cabinet in the budget context.
So therefore you would know that there was a decision being made?
Yeah.
I wonder if a useful thing would be to get you a PMC briefing on this. Like, it's a frustrating scenario, and I know it's frustrated you a number of times in the last couple of weeks. I think it might be useful to do that.
Okay, well...
As an aside.
In the meantime, we can take your question on notice and have a look at what we can say.
Okay, I mean, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Senator Duniam.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got potentially only 3 areas of questions remaining for me today. And so I'll start with the matter of the MMG tailings dam in Tasmania.
Senator will just invite
yes,
my
indeed.
colleagues from Environmental Approvals Division to join us, but if you'd like to...
Sure. Well, and I might just check on one of the potential areas. This might knock it out of play and take it down to only 2 areas of questions. The EDO-EJA funding agreement, would that be something covered in corporate as opposed to outcome 2?
Yes.
I think that's right.
Good.
Environmental Justice Australia.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes,
that's
it's
not
a corporate matter, yes.
Big corporate matter? Okay, I'll put those on notice. So to the questions relating to the MMG project, where are we at in that decision-making process? Because from memory, there were 2 elements to what was being assessed there. If you could
I could very briefly say...
Yes, indeed. Why don't you do that?
Senator, there remain 2 elements. One is the Tasmanian process, and one is the process which the Commonwealth is involved in. The Tasmanian process is the more substantive one. The Commonwealth one is the investigative works, which was the matter of a court process. But I'll invite my colleagues to add any more detail. But those are the two elements of the process. Both remain in train.
Okay. All right.
Kim Farrant, Branch Head, Environmental Assessments, Victoria and Tasmania and Post-Approvals. So in relation to the investigative works, we are still considering that decision after having been directed back to the department for a decision. We are waiting on information from MMG, but also we've recently received information in January of this year from an NGO about a further species that they would like us to consider in more detail. So we're kind of just working through that process currently.
Okay, and does that have a prescribed or legislated timeframe attached to it?
No, it doesn't. Because the investigative works have been directed back to the department from the federal court, it's out of the usual statutory process timeframes that would normally apply to this decision.
Sure.
And in relation to the substantive MMG project on the tailings jam itself, it is in the Tasmanian process.
Yes. So I won't ask you about that. That's fine. We could freelance, but I won't do that too. Okay, that's fine. So no real capacity to give a time frame because you're engaged in that process. So.
That's right. So we're essentially dependent on third parties at the moment.
Sure.
To provide us with information.
All right. Then moving off the investigative works, it's Thursday. The proposal to list the Tarkine, which as a, what is it, Peter? What is the proposal? Like it's to list it as a World Heritage Area, national, yeah. Is there anything on foot in that respect?
So you may be aware, Senator, the Bob Brown Foundation continues to advocate for greater protection. There isn't a formal process in relation to that on foot at the present time.
So the government's not got a proposal. Oh, well. Okay. We might have a difference of opinion about the boundaries of such an area, but more seriously though, so there is no formal process on foot relating to that. Okay. Handy to know. All right, thank you very much. That's all I have on that issue. I wanted to then go to the Samuels review and work we've touched on previously there. While officials, or official, singular, are coming to the table, I wanted to start with the National Environmental Standards, if I can. Thank you. I just wanted to know how the government, well, when will they be drafted? When are we looking at putting these things in place? What's the timeline?
Thank you, Senator. James Tregurtha, Head of Task Force for Environmental Law Reform and establishment of an EPA. In relation to the environmental standards, so we've commenced a process, the Minister committed to working up national environmental standards through a working group process, which will involve quite an extensive series of consultations, largely over the next 4 months. So that's underway already. In fact, we had a meeting of the working group yesterday, and that was the second meeting of the working group. So over the course of the next 4 or so months, we would expect most of the drafting work to be done towards having a draft national environmental standard that could be released alongside an exposure draft of the bill in the second half of this calendar year.
Okay, and so when you say the bill, that's everything responding
That's
to
correct.
Samuels, okay, that we've touched on previously. Okay. That answers the second part of my question, which is how do you intend to make this legally enforceable? So the standards released, the bill notionally would be the enforcement mechanism, or how you would administer?
Legislative changes, so creation of the statutory settings that are provided for within the government's nature positive plan. So that would be things like a bill to establish the National Environment Protection Agency, and then a bill to give effect to those areas of the nature positive plan that require a legislative underpinning.
Yes.
Part of that would be to create the power for the minister to make national environmental standards, but the standards themselves are proposed to be a legislative instrument made separately, so that would all be set out. So if you like, the legislation gives you the power to make the standards, and then the standards would be made into legislative instruments by the minister following the passage of the legislation. So they would be draft when circulated.
Alongside, okay. And they will have their own enforcement and administration mechanisms?
Yes, so the Nature Positive Plan says that the National Environment Protection Agency would be responsible for monitoring compliance with the standards from a regulatory perspective, and the environment data function that's provided for in the plan would be responsible for reporting on the success of the national environmental standards in terms of achieving outcomes for the environment more broadly.
And how will those things be reported, or that will be contemplated in the...
So the environment data function in the Nature Positive Plan sets out the responsibility for monitoring and reporting would be part of that data function. Okay. And so the state of the environment reporting would fall into that area, as well as more interim reporting around how changes in Australia's environment were happening over the course of that period.
Okay, and will all of that reporting timeline, etc., and making all of that information, that data publicly available, will that be legislated requirements, or is it just a commitment?
So certainly some of the reporting obligations would be legislated in the same way that right now the State of the Environment report obligation to have a State of the Environment report every 5 years is part of the existing EPBC Act. So some of those key reporting obligations will be part of the legislative agenda. Okay. But the Nature Positive Plan also anticipates that the environment data function would support the minister in considering a data and information standard that may also give effect to reporting obligations as well.
Understood. Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. Just on the working group, it might be something on notice you wish to provide, but the members of that working group, are they broad community, bureaucracy?
It was a range of members. So there's two, and it might be best for me to take on notice and give you a full answer, Senator, but just in general, there's a smaller group that's been convened as the working group across business and environment groups coming together to support the development of the drafting, and then there's a broader reference group to ensure that all stakeholders have an opportunity to see how that process is progressing and to provide comment at regular periods during the development.
Okay, all right, thank you. On notice, that would be very helpful. Just then to the issue of time taken to have a resolution to applications or referrals. I mean, the point's been made by the Minister that under reformed legislation, under the new regime, it will be faster and therefore cheaper. I mean, how is that going to be delivered? Like, are you able to talk to me about, you may tell me to wait until the draft is tabled to consult upon, but how is that being built in? How do you actually...
So there's a number of aspects and elements to that, Senator. So I'll run through a few in terms of drawing out aspects of the Nature Positive Plan. So the Nature Positive Plan has a section that does talk deliberately about streamlining. And so that goes to elements where, for example, there's a range of there's a wide range of potential pathways for approval in the Act, some of which are rarely used, one of which is potentially quite confusing. So there's a commitment in the Nature Positive Plan to streamline assessment pathways and to ensure that the quickest possible outcomes can be achieved. The implementation of regional plans would be another element that we expect would support a quicker outcome, as regional plans would be able to provide greater information to potential proponents earlier in their process about what was important. I think Mr Knudsen mentioned before about identifying critical areas that would make an approval more difficult, as opposed to other areas where there was less environmental assets or there was more scope for development to occur because you were talking about degraded areas or areas that had already been developed in the past. Yeah. Another aspect of the Nature Positive Plan would be the dedication of the environmental regulatory staff into the national EPA with a very strong and firm commitment towards looking for efficiencies and streamlining in their practices. So that's just a few of the various elements. So largely I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a range of aspects of the plan that drive those faster outcomes.
Okay, and do those range of tools include different, shorter legislated timeframes for the consideration of applications? Well,
so part of the consideration of those policy changes right now is around what aspects of streamlining, so a couple of questions around that, what's viable in terms of being able to practically happen, but then also how those might be given effect through that streamlining elements that I was speaking about earlier. An example of that would be strategic assessments at the moment, where there's a strategic assessment in place in relation to a plan. It's then, if you like, that strategic assessment locks that plan down, so it's not able to be varied easily after that decision is made, even if there's an opportunity for a better environment and a better business outcome to be realised through a variation. So that would be something where we'd be looking at, if we built in a variation, that might be an opportunity, rather than have someone have to redo the process or do a supplementary process, they would be able to seek a variation which would be a faster, more streamlined way of achieving beneficial outcomes on both sides. So it's things like that. But as to what the full suite would be, you're absolutely right. We'll go through that consultation process.
Senator, there's a really key thing here, though, right? Because when an average company has a proposal, it takes about 3.5 years under the current proposal or current legislation to get an approval for complex projects like large mines, etc. One of the key things that we're trying to do is pull forward the information so any citizen, any proponent can figure out where you're likely going to have greater impacts on the environment or on heritage or not. That means that they don't have to spend as much time trying to figure out what's there, what do I need to avoid, et cetera. We really want to make that, so we're bringing the decision forward. And if you think about that 3.5 years, the statutory timeframes, which, you know, we generally meet, and if we miss them, we miss by a few days, is a small proportion, like 1/10. And we'll come back specifically on notice, but it's a small portion of the overall time. It's actually trying to speed up the ability for companies to get proposals that are on a good path for approval, ready and prepared. It's that 3.5 years prior to the approval process at the very back end. That's where the real big savings for business would be.
Okay, perfect. Well, look, all of that I'm sure will come to light in the second half of this year, so I look forward to that. If I can ask about the proposal of conservation payments that was contemplated in what I've read about so far in response to Samuel's. Obviously work is ongoing along with everything else. What is being contemplated about how to measure and price conservation payments?
So, Senator, and I think that the Nature Positive Plan itself actually sets this out in some limited detail, granted, but largely what's been anticipated there is thinking about, I mean, there are a range of different ways to do this, and I think my starting point would be we are still developing the precise nature of how that would work in practice. But fundamentally, the intention is that there'd be an obligation in using a conservation payment to have a positive result. So the whole intent of the plan is to ensure that wherever there was a conservation payment made, the net benefit, if you like, the benefit from the conservation payment would outweigh any impacts of the proponent, of the action of the proponent that was seeking to use that as a vehicle. There'd also be a range of tests that would be required in terms of moving through avoidance, mitigation, whether or not the proponent themselves could undertake an offset that would be able to be procured in relation to that proponent. So it would only be after that process had gone through that a conservation payment would be available. And the reason I'm raising that is because what that means is a conservation payment would inevitably be, you would expect to occur at the end of the process, and therefore the pricing would build in, like, if you like, we would need to price the access to the conservation payment in a way that didn't undermine the offsets regime, and so that would be a driver of the pricing as well. But I guess where I'm going with all of that is to say it's still under development.
Yes, that was very clear to me in your answer there. Just on that though, I mean, when we get to end of development process, I mean, is there going to be some way of, if someone is fairly certain that they're going to end up, once gone through the process, paying a conservation payment, some clarity around what they look like they might be up for?
Oh, absolutely. They'd be very...
Senator, I was simply going to observe that these are very detailed questions about a set of matters that are the subject of consultation. There is a broad consultation about the legal framework that might be put in place. There is consultation to occur about the national environmental standards that might sit under it, and these questions are quite detailed and are the subject of ongoing discussion with stakeholders. And I think whilst officials may provide you with some of the factors to be contemplated, they're not in a position to provide definitive advice of the kind that you're seeking at the moment.
I'm not asking for definitive advice, Minister. I'm asking general questions about what the community could expect at the end of this process in broad terms. I've been very fair in allowing...
That's fine. And there's no. I apologise, Senator. There's no problem with you asking the questions. I was just explaining that the nature of the answers is necessarily contingent because there's this very big community conversation going on about how the implementation implementation arrangements of the nature positive plan will go through.
And
it's appropriate that the community be consulted.
Understanding where these conversations are at, so that's what I'm doing. Then moving off that, understand that there will be a process, and hopefully we will see the second half of this year some detail around that, and I'll keep an eye on that. Just with regard to the EPA, if I can turn to that, and that's obviously all part of the same process, noting, you know, we won't be able to get definitive answers on these things, and I accept that. Once we get to the position of having draft legislation out for broader public consultation, is that what will happen? Second half of this year, working groups have done their work. Second half of this year, we will have everything out for the world to see. Is that right?
We would expect an exposure draft process.
Yes. I'm not going to run around saying this is terrible.
Yes. Bang up against.
Yeah, maybe later.
Bang up against the dinner break.
All right. Well, we'll have to come back then, I suppose. Yes.
Thank you very much. The committee has agreed to cut the dinner break down to half an hour and to finish the session half an hour earlier at 8:30 p.m. So we will break now and return at 7:15. Thank you very much for your time. Yep, see if people have got any interest. I'd like to welcome back officers from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, continuing with outcome 2. We will go to Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. Just a follow-up question on plastics, but coming at it from a different angle. Threat abatement plans for marine debris. As you know, marine debris was listed as a threatening process a long time ago, nearly 20 years ago. There was a threat abatement plan. A threat abatement plan constructed in.
Senator, do you mind if we just? I want to get the right officials
Sure.
to the table. And one of the things I should say, Senator, the division head that's responsible for threat abatement plans overall is out of the country at this point, so we might actually have to take a fair amount on.
You could just take it on notice. It was just a simple question. The last threat abatement plan for marine debris was I think 2018, and they get reviewed every 5 years. So I was just asking if the department was looking at reviewing the threat abatement plan for marine debris.
Sure. Well, why don't we come back with the process that'll happen with respect to that?
Great. Okay, thank you. Just a standard question I ask on sharks. Minister, this committee produced a report into shark mitigation 5-6 years ago, and the previous government didn't respond to it. The evidence was provided to this committee at estimates last year that the department had provided advice in January last year in relation to that report, but no government has responded. I think I might have asked you late last year. Does the government have any plans to respond to that Senate inquiry?
I might seek advice from officials.
Senator, my understanding is there's a range of responses to different inquiries over the last several years, and the government's looking at taking a coordinated approach to responding to those. So there's if you like, a bundling up of several responses, and I believe the sharks inquiry is one of those.
Okay, so it's probably more a question for the Minister on timing, but so to be part of a backlog of reports.
Yeah, that's right, Senator.
All right, well, I'll keep asking. Hopefully we'll get that response. Just quickly though on great white sharks, I also asked last year around the assessment of their status. Has there been any updates on the great white shark?
Just got to switch the officials again,
Yep.
Senator.
The reason I ask is there has been prominent politicians over the years who wanted the great white sharks to be delisted and put up for commercial fishing. So I was just interested if there's, where that process is at.
Senator, my colleague may be able to provide more detail, but as far as I'm aware, there's nothing new to report on that front. So there's no active consideration of delisting, which I think is what your question was.
Right.
That's correct, Senator.
Right. We're through the submission process, and you've looked at all the information, and there's.
Senator, I would need to confirm for you, but we need to check whether the great white shark is on the finalised priority assessment list, and the status of the assessment, if it is on that list. I'm sorry, I don't have that information.
No, that's okay. As I promised the Chair, these would be quick questions, so I look forward to getting an update on that when you can. I've got a slightly abstract question, so if you can't answer it, that's fine. I can put it to the right people on notice. With the EPBC review and new environmental laws, were exemptions for activities under the existing laws looked at? Like, for example, shark nets in New South Wales and Queensland were exempt from EPBC laws because they were in place prior to those laws being implemented. So, although we're getting a number of threatened endangered species killed daily by shark nets, they're not covered under federal law. Are those kind of exemptions being looked at in the review?
Senator, you mean in the review undertaken by Professor Samuels?
Yeah.
Following that. He didn't make any comment in relation to those exemptions, in relation to his recommendations, and the nature positive, nor does the nature positive plan.
Okay, so activities like shark nets, state programs would potentially still be exempt under any new laws.
It'll be a matter for government and Parliament.
But obviously, but it's not. But just to be clear, though, but it's not being considered or looked at in the policy process you're working through now.
It's certainly not referenced in the nature positive plan, Senator. But as Mr. Knudsen says, ultimately that's a matter for government in terms of any variation. Is what we're talking about.
Should I write to you, Minister, and ask you to look at that in your nature positive plan? I mean, obviously there are a number of other exemptions to protected wildlife under the previous EPBC Act.
Two things. Correspondence from fellow parliamentarians is always welcome, and you may certainly write to Minister Plibersek on this question. I think broadly that perhaps we could say that the structure of the arrangements that are proposed under the Nature Positive Plan differ in significant ways to the sort of overall architecture of EPBC. And so there is a process to work through that, but as officials have talked through, there's kind of a headline framework, an enforcement body, and a set of standards against which various arrangements would be tested and evaluated. And so I think it may be that in the course of consultations, other stakeholders raise these matters and say, have you considered the unintended consequence of this particular set of historical arrangements that may fall under the plan? That could be dealt with through the consultation, but we are too early in the process, and officials can indicate whether we've received any representations of that kind so far. But we're at the beginning of a consultation that will be quite extensive.
Okay, but if you bring in a new set of laws, the Nature Positive Plan, you can have an EPA and there's some other structural changes. Will there be exemptions from those new laws?
You're asking a question of speculation.
No, I'm not asking a question of speculation.
Well, so you're asking about whether those provisions will be passed or put in place by the government and/or by Parliament, and that's fundamentally a question for both
you haven't
government and
considered
Parliament.
it. You haven't considered it, so.
Yeah. So Mr. Knudsen has given you advice that Professor Samuel's report was silent on that question, as was the response from the government. We're now embarking on consultation where a range of other consequential matters may well be raised by stakeholders, and any of those issues that were raised in that context would be dealt with by government.
Yeah, I suppose it's more a broader question. Will there be broader exemptions, like historical legacies, in the new laws? When they do exist. So,
All I can repeat is exactly the answer I've given previously, but I would strongly recommend also that we are in the process of doing engagement, and it would be always helpful to hear from the various range of views on key issues that you're concerned about.
All right, I'll write to you in relation to that. A couple of other quick ones. In relation to the Robbins Island wind farm in Tasmania, the Tasmanian EPA, the advice they provided in relation to the project around the orange bellied parrots, that the wind farm shouldn't be operational for 5 months of the year based on the migration of OBPs. Did the Federal Environment Department have any input into the Tasmanian EPA's advice?
That issue, Senator, hasn't been considered by the department, by the Commonwealth. Obviously, we're aware of the Tasmanian EPA process and decision. That, of course, is itself under review, but that matter has not come to the Commonwealth Government at this stage.
Under review, you mean as in under legal challenge?
Indeed.
Okay, but it's obviously it's a federally critically endangered species.
We have a very, very strong interest in the issue and in the particular species, but the question of approval under the EPBC Act by the Commonwealth Department has not arisen yet.
Okay, so it wouldn't be that, for example, is it possible that the Minister would approve or not approve the project based on that advice that the Tasmanian EPA's provided, or would you do your own assessment of OBPs?
The Commonwealth will do its own assessment.
Great, okay, yeah, thank you. In relation to Tasmanian devils, could I get an update on whether they're going to be subject to any kind of recovery plan under the new... I don't think they were on the priority list.
So while the officials are coming to the table, can I answer your great white shark question? So the great white shark is not under the under consideration for assessment for delisting. So it's
Okay,
not
great,
under
thank you.
consideration.
That's very good to hear. Yep, so if I could just get an answer to that, and then I've got one more. I've already asked that question.
Senator, in relation to Tasmanian devils, the situation is the same as the last time we spoke. So as you're aware, there's a comprehensive conservation advice in place, but it is not a species for which a recovery plan is currently required.
I wrote to the Minister a couple of weeks ago about devil facial tumour disease being detected in Woolnorth, which is considered to be a healthy population. Is the department aware of that event?
Yes, yes, we are aware, Senator. It isn't good news.
It's not good news, and would you be able to provide some assistance, or have you been asked to provide assistance, for example, to do a population survey of the existing devils there to see how widespread that is?
So I have already met with the Tasmanian officials to discuss the situation and to see what we can do about it. At this stage, they haven't identified anything that we can do to assist, but if there is, then we will certainly be working with them on that.
Okay, we're going to move on now. Senator
Thanks.
Pocock.
You can come back to me, Chair, when you're through the others.
Just Minister, just to finish off on the nature repair questions from earlier. What my understanding was that a lot of the demand or reasons for demand were linked to something like TNFDs, nature-related financial disclosures. Given that's the case, is the government looking to bring forward that sort of requirement on businesses in Australia?
Yes, so these are questions that where the detail of this question would need to be answered in the Treasury portfolio, but I do know that Treasury is presently undertaking a consultation on the appropriate form of disclosure. As you know, many companies already disclose a variety of information about their climate and sustainability performance, and also any risks that are material to their shareholders or their business. The Treasury has issued a consultation paper and is engaging with businesses and other stakeholders about what kind of standardised framework might be appropriate for Australian businesses. But I am afraid officials here can't provide any provide any further information in great detail. It is one that's being led by Treasury.
Okay. Yep. I've got a few questions for the department about the strategic assessment of Middle Arm.
Sorry, the strategic assessment of
Middle Arm in
We'll get
Darwin
the
Harbour.
onto the table, Senator.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Pocock, I misheard you. And the consultation being undertaken by Treasury is in relation to climate disclosure. My very great apologies. I'm sorry I gave you information about that process. Ms O'Connell may have additional information.
So Senator, in terms of TNFD, there is some way to go yet in terms of establishing the standard. So the Global Task Force will release the standard for TNFD, so the nature disclosure, in September. And there's a difference here, I think, you know, in terms of the investment being in creating a global standard first, whereas what's happened, particularly on the climate side, has been the standard was set after people started measurement. So it's absolutely important that the global standard be set for the disclosure by TNFD. That comes out in September, so there won't be any action taken by anybody until at least that standard is absolutely set and available. Would it be a driver for demand if it was regulated? I think the answer to that is yes, likely to be, but I think there are other drivers that are already present. The ESG obligations and undertakings of corporations, they are looking for products like this. They want products like this, though, that are backed by legislation and have a compliance regime so that it's not subject to sort of greenwashing claims. So the ESG, we talked before about ACCUs that have a biodiversity co-benefit attracting a premium. That tells you there is a market for it. We have been in discussion with many corporates and they are very interested in the nature repair market and the opportunity to demonstrate that they're nature positive.
Thank you. And are there any other markets like this that you're modelling this off, or would this be a world first?
Australia's market, I understand, will be a world first in terms of a nature repair market.
Okay. Have you looked at the learnings from the New South Wales biodiversity market?
Yes, we have. Okay. And we're also conscious that, you know, you can look at the carbon market in terms of just sort of broader market. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Middle Arm?
Yes, we'll close coming.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just looking at the Northern Territory Government's submission to Infrastructure Australia in relation to this proposed Middle Arm, I believe it's been called a Sustainable Development Hub. The Northern Territory Government says it'll be used as a new gas demand centre, and of particular note is the fact that the development is noted as having potential downstream gas processing, including manufacturing of petrochemicals using gas from the Beetaloo Basin, such as paints, chemicals, fertilisers, plastics and fuel. I'm just interested if these industries will be included in the strategic assessment.
Thanks, Senator. I might start, and my colleague might be able to add something. So, in terms of the strategic assessment, that in itself is a program of work to cover the entire development area. So, what it'll do is it'll form the rules and processes that the Northern Territory Government will then apply to all the activities in that area. I just might recap on where that's up to. So, there's a draft terms of reference for that program that needs to be developed. That was open for comment until about the middle of last year, I believe, June 2022. The stage we're up to now is attracting comments, so that people commented on that. The Northern Territory Government will process and consider those comments, and then what they'll do, and they're starting to do already, to your point, is drafting up a draft environmental impact statement and program. That will be the piece that they'll put back out for comment. So in terms of, so there'll be, I think questions like that would have been raised during the consultation process, and they'll be getting more specific around the scope and the nature of activities on that site, and that will feature in the further document that'll go back out for public consultation.
So the final terms of reference are being drafted?
Yeah, so the final terms of reference are kind of been finalised based on those comments now, but in the meantime, the relevant Northern Territory Department has started that kind of environmental management work. So what is the site, what will be the rule sets that might be required, and that'll be the piece, both the terms of reference will be finalised, but that very important piece, which is really the basis of the strategic assessment itself, that later in this year, 2023, will then go out for consultation. So I think the terms of reference are pretty close to being finalised, but that'll be the piece that probably goes to the questions you're asking in terms of the rule sets and what will be included and how will it be managed.
Okay, thank you. When will those terms of reference be released publicly?
Kylie Calhoun, branch head for Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia for environmental approvals. It should be released in the next quarter, but we'll take it on notice and confirm. We're waiting for information back from the Northern Territorians.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the process, who signs off on those terms of reference?
The Minister will.
Minister. And once they're finalised, are they released for public comment, or what's the process from there?
Yes.
Yep. So, Senator, then there's a following process, which is the actual strategic assessment documents. They'll, as I said, there's consultation associated with those, and ultimately for the federal minister, she'll endorse at a point in time, and then consider an approval. But so there's quite a few steps before we get to that stage.
And will those terms of reference likely include an assessment of the greenhouse gas emissions from Middle Arm?
Not sure we have the details.
Senator, I can answer that. That will be a case by case, so it depends on the information provided.
And in this case?
That will be case by case, so it depends.
Okay. At this stage, is it in the draft at the moment?
It will depend on the class of actions that actually fall under the strategic assessment, and so since we're still doing the draft terms of reference, until they're finalised, it's not something that we can confirm.
And as a department, what's your process? If it's a case-by-case basis, what are your sort of guiding principles for whether it's this case or that case?
The key issue, Senator, is whether, so as you know, or as you may know, emissions are not themselves a matter of national environmental significance. So the question is whether the quantum of emissions arising in relation to a particular project amount to a degree which would have an impact on a matter of national environmental significance, so a particular species or habitat or such matter. So it's entirely case by case. It depends.
And what's that threshold at which it will have that effect?
It depends on the information provided. So there's not a specific threshold. It depends on the scale of the project, and it depends on the information provided by the proponent, and of course it depends on the nature, the work undertaken in the course of the assessment, and that would include, of course, information provided by parties other than the proponent.
Okay. Okay. Given this is a gas and petrochemical hub, is it likely to, do other projects like this usually meet that threshold?
It depends, Senator. It would be improper of me to preempt the Minister's consideration.
Okay, so that's for the Minister to decide?
Well, it's for part of the decision-making process, yes.
Okay. So the department takes all those factors into account and then suggests or recommends to the Minister to include greenhouse gas as a consideration? If
there is evidence of a scale of emissions such as to have a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance, it could be taken into account, yes, but it will be a case-by-case decision.
And in the department, when you're dealing with threatened species, what does significant mean?
So I don't have I don't have a definition in my mind. Maybe my colleagues can help me. But
So there was a court case that determined, as best as we have it, a definition of what a significant impact means. But I'm not sure if we have it at the table.
We won't have it in the table.
But we can provide it.
Okay, I'd love to have that if that's possible.
Yeah.
Would climate risk modelling be part of the terms of reference? How do you decide that?
are you asking in relation to the Middle Arm project's terms of reference, or?
Yes.
I don't think that's not been determined at this stage.
Okay, I've just got a few more on this, and then I can wrap up Middle Arm. Or unless you want
go
to.
quickly, would be lovely.
Is sea level rise something that you would be looking at?
So, Senator, again, it's very hard to know what will be in this one, but it's important the construct of the Act is around the impacts on the protected matters that we're concerned with. So there'll be inputs and that will be considered through the terms of reference process, but broader climatic changes would need to be, I suppose, attributed, if you like, to that specific action. Okay. So that's the sort of material that needs to be thought through very carefully, and that's, as Mr. Larson said, it's why very much is a case by case.
Okay. Are you able to? I'm really just interested to understand. Are you able to table some guidelines that you use for this sort of thinking? That would be really helpful.
So, Senator, we can absolutely provide you not only with the court decision that I was referring to earlier on, but also we can provide you with the significant impact guidelines that lay that out, and those are publicly available.
Thank you. And then just finally, Chair, I understand there's a thriving colony of black-footed tree rats at Middle Arm. They're endangered under EPBC listing, and I'm just interested, what will the impacts of the development be on this colony?
So, Senator, that is the piece that will come through the draft program that's been developed by the Northern Territory Government, but that is a good example where you'll have a particular protected matter and they'll have an allowable impact that will be determined under the management strategies they put in place, and you'll have a series of rules and processes that the holder of the strategic assessment will need to follow to make sure that that matter is protected. So it's too hard to say at the moment because we haven't seen that material developed by Northern Territory yet.
Okay. Can you give me an idea of the amount of funding that's been set aside or is being put towards this assessment to get it done?
So it's a Northern Territory government process. So the proponent, so in this case it's the Northern Territory Government, they're responsible for developing up, if you like, their plan. So what they propose to do. So I don't think we have information about.
So the Northern Territory is doing the strategic assessment for Middle Arm.
Yeah, so that's right. So we work with them to help guide the process and to explain the rules under the Act, and we'll help to guide as we go. But it's essentially the proponent putting forward what we call a landscape scale approach to a particular precinct or area. So they have to undertake that work, and we'll support them with guidance about our requirements.
And how do you ensure that that is done sort of independently and at arm's length by the proponent, given the obvious sort of conflict of interest there?
Well, I think, Senator, that's why there's a role for the Commonwealth to be satisfied with the terms of reference, to consider appropriate endorsements and approvals through the way. And we do provide advice, as I said, on the sorts of requirements that they will need to consider and build in.
And Senator, every project assessed, and as far as I know, in every country, you have it led by the proponent. They're the ones that develop the environmental impact statement. It's then up to the regulator to say, exactly as you suggested, is this of sufficient quality, et cetera, to therefore proceed for consideration by a minister. So there are checks and balances, but it's basically a system whereby a proponent, a company or a jurisdiction that's looking to do something develops the assessment that then comes to the regulator for decision.
Okay, thank you.
Senator, if I could Chair, if I could take a moment, could I draw your attention to, we have guidelines on matters of national environmental significance available on our website. They don't perhaps define the threshold issue that you were interested in, but they elaborate on aspects which are relevant to your questions.
Do you review these? I'm just thinking, like, given our status as extinction sort of world leaders, and this is the process, do we go back and review these projects that have been approved to make sure that it all kind of lined up and that they're not having more of an impact than they were? And what is that review period?
So the strategic assessment undergoes a 5-yearly review period, which is a fairly comprehensive review to look at what improvements need to be built in or what's been achieved against what the requirements were.
Okay. Can I just advise that we have released the Threatened Species Commissioner? Scientific Committee, sorry. Get it right. Threatened Species Scientific Committee has been let go. We'll now go to Senator Duniam.
Chair, my last set of questions relate to the EPA as part of those questions we were asking before. And while the officials come to the table, I just wanted to ask around the notion of cost recovery. Now, again, accepting that this is all very much in development phase, but I just wanted to get an understanding of what might be in contemplation here. Is there a model that's being viewed as a good template or something like that? So how is the government intending to manage that component of it?
So the government's response indicated that we will be looking to establish an EPA, and with respect to cost recovery, that will be something that will be pursued. But like we were saying earlier on, we're very early in the process. We're trying to figure out what the scope of that looks like, and so there's no decisions that have been made. We're just looking at cost recovery as a
And will that detail be something that is available for public consumption in the second half of this year?
Senator, that'll depend on how that process goes. Like I said, we're right at the very beginning of the consultation on not only the legislation, but also on looking at the response that the government put out and how to give life to that.
Yeah, sorry, I may be confused. I had an assumption that the whole lot was being dealt with as a job lot, including any structures around things like the EPA, and that public consultation on all of that would be in the second half of this year. Was I mistaken?
That is what we said. That's correct.
Right, okay.
But you're asking about cost recovery, and all I'm saying is that is something that we're just starting on, et cetera, and I can't answer your question.
No, and my second question was, of course, will that be consulted on in the second half of this year, publicly?
So what I would suggest then, Senator, is I'll come back to you on notice with the process.
Right, okay, so that may be part of the process. You'll let me know on notice. Okay. That will be very interesting then. Also on notice then, perhaps as part of the work that's being undertaken to inform what eventually goes out for public consultation, any modelling that's been done around projected workloads for the EPA? I'd be interested in that.
Again,
yes?
It's we're at the beginning stage.
Yep, thank you. That's all I ask. Has the department looked to any other jurisdictions as a template for the work that's been done to date, or is it just a blank canvas?
Absolutely. There are EPAs existing not only around the country but also internationally, and so we need to look at those models.
Okay, if on notice you could tell me which ones we've looked at in the process, that would be helpful as well. And in answering that, perhaps any elements that are of interest to from any of these jurisdictions that might form the basis of what we do. It is early days, as you've said multiple times in relation to this. Has any consideration been given to an appeals and complaint process? Will that be a part of the EPA, or will it be through some equivalent or successor to the AAT process or the courts? What's the general thinking?
So I'll turn to Mr. Jugurtha in terms of what's been laid out in the response to date. And that's the other thing I would say, Senator. There's a fair amount of detail in the response that talks about the EPA as a whole.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. In terms of the complaints and appeals process, much of the architecture of that will reflect existing settings under the EPBC Act. So, as Mr. Knudsen's already said, we're still in a period of consultation around the exact and precise nature of that. I guess, all I would say around that is the it's probably just leave it at that. That's where we're at the moment.
Okay, and so Mr Knudsen, you said a lot of details in what's been released already.
Yes.
So if you can point to any answers to the questions I've asked in the detail that's on the public record, that'd be helpful. And the rest of my questions I'll put on notice.
Thank you very much, Senator Duniam. Senator Schwarzen.
People back, please. I've just got a few more quick questions for them. Thanks. Ms Kennedy, you mentioned you met with, I think you said you met with your Tasmanian counterparts on the facial tumour area being detected in Woolnorth. You also mentioned that there's no recovery plan in place for the Devil. My understanding, having written to the previous Minister, Lay, was that the last time the federal government committed funds towards the Tassie Devil recovery plan was 2017, and that her response to me was that the Devil tumour disease was under control at that point, and that the federal government had discharged their responsibilities. Is it true that there hasn't been any federal funding towards the Devil recovery plan since 2017?
Senator, I'm going to need to take it on notice.
Sure.
I'm sorry. I do have some information here about overarching funding that's gone from the Tasmanian government, but I don't think it actually answers your question. So if I can take it on notice.
I think it was a joint venture in the Save the Devil program.
Yes.
Both state and federal government were contributing.
Yes, that's correct. So, I mean, we do have some new funding that is coming online in terms of the Saving Native Species program, which we've discussed here before, which is $224.5 million, and there will be, opportunities for funding under that program available in coming months. Yep. But I think that in terms of answering your question about current funding to the Devil, I would need to take that on notice.
And when you say opportunities, how does that funding get accessed? Does this, for example, the state government in this instance apply for it or seek assistance, or do people make submissions to you, or do you have a process?
We're still working through the detail, but the answer is potentially all of the above of those options that you've talked about there. So there will be some community grants rounds, but we also will be looking to work with states, particularly where there are areas where we can partner together in the sorts of programs that you're talking about there. So.
Because one of the big issues, especially with that Woolnorth population, has been roadkill. You're probably aware of a very large number of roadkill, at least 180 devils we know of that have been reported to the Save the Devil Fund.
Yes.
They used to be biopsied, and they don't have the funding to do that anymore, but obviously they're scraped off the road, and it's pretty obvious. And we've been trying to get the speed limits reduced in the area as one measure, but there's a number of other things to be done. Would that be something that might be eligible for some funding, roadkill mitigation measures?
The roadkill issue is really one for the Tasmanian government.
Right.
So the guidelines for these programs have not been settled yet. We're still working through the details of it with the Minister. But it's certainly something that we have raised with our Tasmanian colleagues when we get the opportunity. It is something we're very aware of as well. But that is the sort of issue that really is within the control of the Tasmanian government. Okay. So I think it probably isn't the sort of thing that we would be funding at the Commonwealth level, to be perfectly honest. Okay.
But in terms of the Devil's status, your understanding at the moment is it's obviously still endangered, but you're confident. The state government have been making statements that it's under control, that they think the facial tumour disease is under control. It's not heading towards extinction like we maybe thought 10 years ago. Is the federal government have a view on the status of the Devil? Or is it, when you assess these cumulative pressures, to a species like the Tassie devil?
Look, again, I'd probably like to come back to you on notice with that. So the conversation that I had a week or so ago with the Tasmanian colleagues was just when this research was coming out about the new situation in the northwest there.
Yeah.
And I know I've seen the reports that have come from the state government as well, but I think there's a little bit of work that we still need to do there in terms of understanding exactly what the situation is. So if we could take that on notice, that would be great.
And no doubt you'll probably also be looking at this in terms of the Robbins Island impact assessment, because there is hopefully still a facial tumour disease free population on that island, but it is very close to where the devil was found recently. So, you know, that's why I think surveys are really important. But anyway, I'd like to keep in touch with you on that if that's. Yeah,
Yes,
not on the Robbins Island issue so much, but just on whether we can get some kind of survey done.
Look, absolutely. Let me take that on notice. I think that, as you've said, it was colleagues before who were talking about the Robbins Island issue, so that's something slightly different, but it is endangered, so there is a conservation advice that has to be applied in terms of any assessments that are being undertaken under the EPBC Act.
Did you want to add anything?
No, I think we're fine. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, it's just a couple of other questions. I'll try to get through them really quickly for the chair. Just in relation to Great Barrier Reef, so these aren't questions for the Great Barrier Reef Authority, who we had here before, but these are for the department. The climate vulnerabilities of World Heritage listed properties produced by CSIRO was released late last year. Did the department have any input into the initiation of this report, or was this done independently by CSIRO?
I don't recall whether it's correct to say we commissioned the report, but we were involved with the report, and it's a report that we sought. Yes.
Okay, so you sought the report, the Environment Department.
It was part of the process, Senator, in relation to dealing with climate impacts more generally on World Heritage properties, and it was the development of a toolkit for managing the impacts of climate change on World Heritage, and we were closely involved, yes.
Okay, great. Can you outline the properties most at risk?
Identified by CSIRO.
Yeah, in the report.
Senator, I don't have the report in front of me, but possibly a colleague can, or we can certainly get that information for you.
Or also, are they all at risk?
There's a significant number of natural properties in Australia which are at risk. If you look at the IUCN report of World Heritage properties, I think they identify 83 or so properties that internationally at high or very high risk. And possibly my colleague will actually identify the Australian properties which were addressed by CSIRO. But I think the important thing about the CSIRO report was not specifically to identify the level of risk. It was to address the question of how do you manage climate impacts.
Okay, yeah, no, I certainly got some questions on that. I just wanted to know which were the ones most at risk. I just had a quick skim through it, and it looked like the Great Barrier Reef, Blue Mountains and Gondwana Rainforest were the three key.
Well, we certainly accept that the impact of climate change is one of the greatest threats affecting the reef. But I think the reality is that a very large number of Australia's and international natural World Heritage properties are clearly are threatened by climate change.
Yeah, I just wanted to get on record. But from what I can see, was there any properties that are not affected by climate change? I think the answer might be no to that. I think they're all at very.
I think that clearly there is potential for any natural property to be impacted by climate change.
Okay. So in relation to what you mentioned earlier, then, has the department are you planning to make changes to your decision making and funding allocation based on the vulnerabilities provided by this report?
So what the report was intended to do was to provide a toolkit for helping manage climate vulnerabilities. In the Australian case, in the case of Australian World Heritage properties, As you'd expect, we have advanced management plans in relation to those properties. Some of those properties are managed at the Commonwealth Government level, others are managed at the state government level, and they are funded to ensure their preservation in line with our World Heritage commitments.
Okay. Have any ministers, has the department, I suppose, briefed any other ministers about the implications of the report in terms of our international obligations?
So when you say
any
other
since the
ministers?
report's landed, have any other ministers for other departments been briefed about the vulnerabilities outlined in this report?
Not that I'm aware, Senator.
Okay. Is the department working with IUCN and the World Heritage Committee on developing a global tool for assessing climate vulnerabilities?
We work closely with IUCN in a range of contexts, including in relation to climate vulnerability. There is also, in the World Heritage context, the development of a climate policy, the World Heritage Committee context. So yes, we're working across the spectrum with a range of international actors, including IUCN.
So do other tools exist in relation to this? Is this kind of...
There's a range. Yeah, there's a range of products which look at these issues. Yes.
Right. Okay. So on the Great Barrier Reef in particular, in relation to its World Heritage values, can I just get a quick update in relation to the process around World Heritage in danger listing, or the recommendation to inscribe the Great Barrier Reef on the list of World Heritage in danger? Has the Environment Minister met with representatives of UNESCO, IUCN about the monitoring mission report?
Yes, Senator.
She has met with them?
Since
the report was released?
Yes, the Minister has met with the Director General of UNESCO.
Okay, and when did that happen?
That occurred in mid-December.
And what was that meeting about?
The meeting was in the margins of the Convention on the Global Biodiversity Conference in Montreal, and the meeting was to touch on matters of Australia UNESCO interest, and included touching on the status of the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay, the status of the Great Barrier Reef, including a potential inscribing of the reef on the World Heritage Danger List.
One of the items on the forthcoming World Heritage Committee agenda, the meeting has now been set for September 2023.
In Saudi Arabia,
will be a consideration of the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay, is the Minister currently speaking to any of the UNESCO members of that committee on this specific issue?
Not that I'm aware, Senator.
Sorry, Mr. Knudsen.
I was just suggesting that we can also...
I'll confirm my answer.
Yeah,
I'll confirm the answer I've already provided, Senator, which is not that I'm aware.
Because obviously the previous Environment Minister, Minister Ley, jet-setted around the world, going to all these countries to meet with them, to lobby them to vote with Australia not to inscribe the World Heritage Committee. Sorry, not to inscribe the Barrier Reef on the World Heritage in danger list.
That is not... Minister Plibersek has not, to my knowledge, met with counterpart ministers on this issue.
Okay. But Senator McAllister, is it the government's position to continue to argue against the listing of the Great Barrier Reef at the next World Heritage Committee meeting in Saudi Arabia?
Look, I think officials can provide some indication about the approach and the responses that we've provided so far. I think, as Mr Larson indicated to you earlier, we consider that climate change represents threats to many natural assets, many World Heritage natural assets, certainly to reef systems, and that includes the Great Barrier Reef. But Mr Larson may have other details to add about the responses and the process around our response.
So, Senator, as you may be aware, a draft reactive monitoring mission report was provided to us over the course of 2022. Australia provided some response.
I've read that response
to that. And the next step in the process from the perspective of the UNESCO Secretariat or the World Heritage Centre is to prepare materials for consideration by the World Heritage Committee, and I'm aware that the UNESCO Secretariat is doing that at the present time.
Okay. On page 41 of the report prepared by CSIRO, the implications of climate change for World Heritage properties in Australia, it talks about potential impacts on outstanding universal value of the Great Barrier Reef. It describes several possible futures for the Great Barrier Reef under climate change. The first of these is a possible future from 2030 to 2050 in which global average temperatures are 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the World Heritage elements of the reef had significantly deteriorated. This possible future comprises a more drab-looking reef with fewer branching and plate corals, fewer colourful reef fish, and loss and degradation of seagrass and meadows. And it goes on to talk about a whole range of impacts. Minister, your 43% target equated to a 2 degree of warming, or accepting a 2 degree of warming. Are you aware of the impacts of that kind of warming on the Great Barrier Reef?
Senator Whish-Wilson, we are acutely aware of the threats posed to a range of natural assets and indeed to infrastructure, ways of Australian way of living by climate change. And it's on that basis that our government has taken very firm action to turn around a decade of wasted time on climate policy in this country.
But if that action and the blueprint that's before us with the safeguard mechanism is going to equate to a 2 degree of warming, and we accept that, and that 2 degree of warming equates to a 99% loss of coral on the Great Barrier Reef, how is that taking action to save the Great Barrier Reef?
Senator Whish-Wilson, we talked about this before in the chamber, but a number of things. The 43% target is a floor, not a ceiling, as Minister Bowen has frequently said. And, you know, our goal is to set Australia on a path for net zero. We also understand that this is something we have to do in partnership with other countries, and it's on that basis that we're engaging very energetically with partner nations, because the entire world is going to need to grapple with this challenge, and we're in a very important decade.
Indeed. So what does net zero by 2050 equate to in a future global warming scenario? What does the science tell us about that?
Well, the advice that has been provided through the Paris Agreement, and we are now straying outside of the portfolio that's under examination, is that net zero by 2050 is the target we are pursuing.
Yeah, but what target is that? Is that a 2 degree warming, a 3 degree warming? 4 degrees?
The Paris Agreement asks us to keep global warming, requires the nations of the world to keep global warming to under 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5.
Okay, so Australia is currently at 1.5, according to CSIRO on pre-industrial levels. It's possible with a big El Nino year, the planet might get to 1.5 this year.
Senator Whish-Wilson, you don't find any quarrel with me around the question that this is a serious situation. We've come to government 8 or 9 months ago. We have very rapidly set about updating our commitments to the international community, legislating those commitments through our parliament, developing the policy mechanisms that will allow us to deliver on those commitments. But I will say, I think we've offered some amount of latitude in straying into the climate portfolio, but we did have a very extended discussion about this just a couple of weeks ago here in this room.
This report was commissioned by your department, which is about climate impacts on World Heritage, including the Great Barrier Reef. That's why I'm asking you climate questions. I don't believe I have strayed outside the portfolio that we're dealing with. I'll leave that for that, Chair. I've just got one more set of questions which I'll get through very quickly, and then I'll put everything else on notice. Thank you. In relation to NT Savannah, there's been a number of media reports around illegal land clearing. In January this year, ABC revealed that land clearing in the Northern Territory is booming as the cotton industry sets its sights on expanding there. Extensive land clearing of thousands of hectares is routinely planned in the Northern Territory in habitat of nationally threatened species, yet it's never referred for assessment or approval under the EPBC Act. More than 67,000 hectares have been proposed for land clearing in the last 3 years. The Minister Plibersek said in response to this report and this investigation she was very concerned and that there must be serious consequences for anyone who does the wrong thing. And the ABC then also reported the department is investigating potentially unlawful clearing and has requested advice from the NT government. Could you give us an update on that situation, please?
Yes, so Senator, my name's Graham Grossi. I'm the branch head of the Environment Compliance Branch. I can say that, yes, there are a number of matters under investigation in the Northern Territory, and I won't be able to provide much further comment than that.
Right, okay, because it's currently under active investigation.
That's correct.
Okay. Are you able to tell us if you're investigating all 3 stations that were the subject of the ABC article?
Yes, we've made that public, yes.
You have, okay. And when an outcome could be expected of the investigation?
I can't give you that, Senator. They're complex matters, obviously, and they have to go back and forth with specific advice and assessments.
What advice was sought by the department from the NT government about a clearing approval for one of the properties investigated by the ABC?
I won't go into that, Senator, as well, because it's relevant to the investigation as well.
Okay. Is the department now actively monitoring all proposals for land clearing in the Northern Territory to ensure, for example, those actions are referred under the EPBC Act for approval?
Yeah, look, as part of our compliance measures, monitoring is a component of that. We don't normally publicly release what we're monitoring, but needless to say, we do monitor via satellite imagery and various other methods.
Could I ask, did you detect those other significant potentially illegal land clearings?
In terms of?
In terms of the ABC article with the 3 stations that they reference, was it you who initiated? Was it? Did you? Sorry, I'll rephrase it. Did you detect those potential breaches through your own?
No, what I can say, there was no referrals to the department in terms of land clearing by the persons involved in land clearing.
Yeah.
But we do receive allegations through a variety of other methods. Yeah.
Okay, so it's potentially come through third parties. Has the department to date requested that any land clearing proposals in the NT be referred for assessment and approval under the EPBC Act?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay. And last question, Chair. Beyond the particular stations that were the subject of the ABC article, has the department commenced investigating whether any other land clearing in the NT has had or is likely to have a significant impact on EPBC listed species? And if so, at which stations?
No, those 3 are the current matters under investigation.
Okay. I can put the other questions on notice, Chair.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Senator Whish-Wilson. And that appears to be that. I'd like to thank all the witnesses who appeared and particularly thank you to Broadcasting, Hansard, the Secretariat, and remind senators that the committee has agreed that any written questions on notice should be lodged with the Secretariat by the 17th of March. The committee stands adjourned.